If you stand on the courthouse square in Manchester, Kentucky, and just listen, you can almost feel it. The sounds of today, the hum of traffic, the distant laughter from a storefront, they're just a thin veneer. Beneath that, there's an echo, a deep, cold resonance in the very ground beneath your feet. Because it was right here, on this patch of earth, that a man of God committed an unholy act in broad daylight. He took a life, and in doing so, held a mirror up to the soul of a time and a place known to history as Bloody Clay. The question that hangs in the air, even after more than a century, isn't just about the crack of the pistol that shattered the autumn quiet. It's about the man who pulled the trigger. How does a devout Methodist minister, a man sworn to peace, become a killer? And more chillingly, how does a jury of his peers look upon that act and call it justice? Today, we're going to listen to those echoes. These old bricks and this worn-down soil have a story to tell, and we are here to piece it together. To understand what happened on that courthouse square, you have to rewind the clock to 1899 and step into a world that feels both ancient and terrifyingly raw. This is Clay County, Kentucky. Deep in the Cumberland Mountains, cut off by ridges and creeks, this place had its own set of rules, and they were written in blood. The rest of America was looking forward to a new century of progress, but here, the wounds of the Civil War were still fresh, still weeping. They called it Bloody Clay, and it was a name earned through decades of ambush, assassination, and open warfare on the streets. The war had split this land down the middle, not just north and south, but neighbor against neighbor, cousin against cousin. The Baker clan, staunchly Unionist and Republican, found themselves locked in a bitter struggle for power against a formidable alliance of ex-Confederate families, the Howards, the Whites, and the Gilberts. This wasn't just about who sat in the courthouse. It was a feud over everything. It was about land, about the profits from the salt mines, and most of all, it was about honor. In these mountains, a man's honor was his most valuable possession, and an insult to it demanded a violent reply. In the middle of this cauldron walked Reverend George D. Baker. He was no backwoods preacher screaming at the sky. He was a respected traveling Methodist minister, a man whose words could soothe a grieving widow or inspire a congregation to grace. In a community held together by faith and family, the preacher was meant to be the moral compass, the peacemaker who stood above the endless cycle of revenge. He was the shepherd, meant to guide his flock away from the darkness. But George Baker had a second identity, one that was fused to his very bones. He was a Baker. He was born into the feud, raised on stories of kinsmen shot from their saddles or gunned down in town. The unwritten law of the mountains was absolute. Blood answers for blood. A man stood with his family, or he stood for nothing at all. Every day of his life, Reverend Baker walked an impossible tightrope, balancing the teachings of Christ's forgiveness in one hand and the heavy burden of his clan's honor in the other. His direct rival, the man who embodied everything the Bakers fought against, was Tom Howard. Howard was not just another feudist with a quick temper, he was the elected Clay County clerk. He held a position of legitimate power, controlling records, documents, and the official gears of local government. As a leader of the Democratic faction, he was the public face of the Baker family's oldest and deadliest enemies. And so, the stage was set. The town of Manchester was a tinderbox, and these two men were like sparks in the wind. Every time their paths crossed on the dusty main street, the air would grow thick and cold. It was more than a personal dislike. It was a collision of two worlds. It was the law of the state versus the law of the clan, the power of the vote versus the power of the gun. And in Bloody Clay, everyone knew that sooner or later, one of them would have to give way. The real work of understanding a story like this happens away from the courthouse square, in the quiet, dusty rooms where the past is filed away. It's a hunt through county archives, turning the fragile pages of old ledgers, the air thick with the smell of brittle paper and decaying ink. You're searching for more than just facts. You're looking for the voice of the time, a whisper from the world that was. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you find it. In a collection of local papers from the turn of the century, I found this. It's a clipping from the Clay County Republican, dated just 2 days after the killing. The paper is yellowed and flakes at the edges, but the headline is bold and clear. A necessary act. Reverend Baker defends his life against aggressor. It's not a headline reporting a tragedy. It's a headline declaring a victory. Reading the article is like looking at a photograph where the focus has been deliberately blurred. It paints Tom Howard as a belligerent tyrant and Reverend Baker as a patient man of God pushed beyond his limits. It speaks of Howard's known history of threats and Baker's unimpeachable character. This isn't just a news report. It's a carefully crafted piece of propaganda written by Baker's political allies to control the narrative before the body was even cold. This single piece of paper proves that the shooting wasn't an isolated event born of a chance argument. It was the climax of a public and vicious feud that had been escalating for some time. This article is a weapon, fired in a war of words that was already raging. And it raises a chilling question. What were they fighting about? What was the final, unforgivable offense that pushed these two men from veiled threats and political maneuvering to a deadly confrontation in the street? That newspaper clipping was not the beginning of the story, but the result of a deliberate and escalating campaign. In the months leading up to that November day, the feud had shifted from simmering resentment to an open war of words fought in the pages of rival newspapers. The Clay County Republican, the voice of the Baker clan, began a relentless assault on Tom Howard. Week after week, it printed articles accusing the county clerk of corruption, of abusing his office for personal gain, and of being a political tyrant who ruled through fear. Each article was a public slap in the face, a calculated attack on Howard's honor designed to undermine his authority in the eyes of the people. They painted him as a snake in the very heart of the county government. For a man in his position, in a place like Clay County, these were not mere political jabs. They were accusations that demanded a response. And in a land where a man's reputation was all he had, a response often meant violence. This is where Reverend George D. Baker stepped from the pulpit into the heart of the conflict. He wasn't just a passive supporter of his family's newspaper. His sermons, known for their fiery passion, began to take on a new, sharper edge. He preached about sin and corruption, about the duty of good men to stand against the forces of darkness in their community. While he may not have named Tom Howard from the pulpit, everyone in the pews knew exactly who the serpents and money changers in the temple were. He was giving his clan's political war a divine sanction, transforming a struggle for power into a holy crusade. Tom Howard found himself besieged. His name was being dragged through the mud in print, and now the most respected preacher in the region was calling down hellfire upon him every Sunday. He was being politically and morally isolated. Cornered and enraged, Howard did what feudists do. He pushed back. He began making public threats. On the streets of Manchester, in saloons and storefronts, he made it known that if the lies didn't stop, he would silence the liars himself. And he specifically named Reverend George D. Baker. The seeds of conflict were now fully sown. The battle had moved from the printed page to open, verbal threats. The entire town of Manchester could feel the change in the air. The tension was no longer a political disagreement. It was a personal death threat. Two of the most powerful men in Clay County were on a collision course, and everyone was just waiting for the crash. It was no longer a question of if it would happen, but when. Newspapers and official records can give you the skeleton of a story, but they can't give you its heart. To find that, you have to talk to the people who have kept the story alive, not on paper, but in memory. In Clay County, there are still folks who hold the oral traditions, the tales passed down over generations that fill in the gaps the official histories leave behind. I found one of them in an old-timer named Silas. a local historian whose family has lived in these hills since before Kentucky was a state. We sat on his front porch, the afternoon sun filtering through the oak trees, and he spoke of the past as if it were yesterday. He listened patiently as I recounted the details I'd found, the newspaper war, the political maneuvering. He just nodded slowly, a wry smile on his face. "That's the official story," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "That's the part they wanted everyone to see. But the old folks in my family, they always said the real trouble, the thing that made it all unavoidable, happened just 3 days before the shooting. It wasn't in any newspaper. According to the story passed down in his family, Tom Howard, pushed to the breaking point by the relentless attacks, finally went looking for the Reverend. He didn't find him in the courthouse or a saloon, but on the street, not far from the Methodist church. He walked right up to Baker, his face a mask of cold fury. And what he said wasn't just a threat, it was an attack on the man's very soul. He didn't yell, Silas told me. He spoke just loud enough for Baker to hear. "You hide your feud behind that Bible, preacher," Howard hissed. "You call me a sinner from your pulpit while you sick your family's dogs on me in the papers. You ain't a man of God. You're a coward, using the cross as a shield for your own hate." In that moment, Tom Howard did more than just insult George Baker. He ripped away the one thing that allowed the preacher to reconcile the two halves of his life. He accused him of being a hypocrite and a coward, invalidating his faith and his honor in a single breath. As Silas finished the story, he looked at me, his eyes clear and steady. "Now you understand," he said. After that was said, one of them had to die. It was just a matter of who got the first shot. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not a wild brawl in a smoky saloon. It was something far more chilling. Just 3 days before the end, Tom Howard found what he was looking for. He saw the Reverend George Baker walking along the main street, not far from the shadow of his own church steeple. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the usual bustle of Manchester seemed to fade into a low hum as Howard altered his course, his steps deliberate and heavy on the hard-packed dirt. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply moved to block the preacher's path, forcing him to stop. For a moment, the two most powerful enemies in Clay County stood face to face, the space between them crackling with generations of hate. Witnesses would later say that Howard's voice was low, controlled, a venom colder than the November wind. He looked the minister dead in the eye, and the words he spoke were not a challenge to a fight, but a judgment on a man's soul. "You hide your feud behind that Bible, preacher," Howard said, the words cutting through the quiet air. "You call me a sinner from your pulpit while you sick your family's dogs on me in the papers." He took a slight step closer, his gaze unwavering. "You ain't a man of God. You're a coward, using the cross as a shield for your own hate." In that single devastating moment, Tom Howard had found the one weapon that could pierce George Baker's armor. He didn't just question his honor as a Baker, he publicly condemned his integrity as a man of faith. He declared that the Reverend's entire life, his ministry, his moral authority, was a lie. For a man who had built his identity on those two irreconcilable pillars, clan and cloth, it was an accusation of absolute spiritual bankruptcy. The tightrope he had walked for so long had just been severed. George Baker said nothing. He simply stood there, his face a stone mask. But something in his eyes changed. The fire of the preacher was extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard glint of the feudist. The argument was over. The debates, the sermons, the newspaper articles, they were all meaningless now. Tom Howard had delivered the final, unforgivable insult, and in the unwritten law of bloody clay, such a thing could only be answered one way. Howard turned and walked away, leaving the minister standing alone in the street. But it was too late. The line had been crossed, the words had been spoken, and they could never be taken back. In that quiet, tense exchange, a death sentence had been passed. The only question left was who would be the executioner and who would be the condemned. So I'm standing here now, back on the courthouse square in Manchester. The building you see today isn't the one that stood here in 1899. That was an older, two-story brick building, the kind with tall windows that seem to look down on the town like weary old eyes. That building is gone, lost to time and progress. But the ground is the same. The earth that drank Tom Howard's blood is still right here, paved over, but present. This whole square is a witness mark, right here. This is where it happened. The county clerk's office was in that original courthouse, so Tom Howard would have been walking right across this very path, maybe heading for the street. And based on all accounts, Reverend Baker was approaching from that direction, coming into the heart of town. This patch of ground was their collision point, the inevitable destination for two men who had run out of words. This wasn't an ambush in a dark hollow or a fight in a lawless saloon. This was a confrontation set to happen in the very center of civic life, in the shadow of the law itself. Storekeepers would have been sweeping their porches, farmers negotiating prices, children running errands. They were all about to become the audience for the final bloody act of a drama that had been building for months. They were about to see the moment when the last thread of civility in bloody clay finally snapped. On that fateful November day, the inevitable finally arrived. Reverend George Baker and Tom Howard met on the courthouse square. The exact words spoken between them were lost to the wind and the partisan accounts that followed, but they were surely little more than a final, venomous formality. It was the last spark falling onto a powder keg that had been packed with generations of hatred and a week of unforgivable insults. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. The clatter of wagons, the murmur of conversation, it all seemed to fade away as the two men stood locked in that final, silent challenge. Then, a blur of motion, a hand diving beneath a coat. The sound that shattered the afternoon quiet wasn't a single shot, but a deafening, thunderous crack of pistols echoing between the wooden storefronts. It wasn't the sound of a fight. It was the sound of an ending. Pigeons scattered from the courthouse roof in a frantic grey cloud. A woman on the far side of the square dropped a basket of apples, and they rolled, unheeded, across the dirt. Everything froze. When the smoke cleared, the scene was stark and horrifyingly simple. Tom Howard was on his feet, but only just. He staggered back a step, a look of profound surprise on his face, his hand clutching at his chest. A dark patch began to bloom across his shirt, a terrible flower of violence. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Then, with a finality that silenced the entire town, he collapsed in a heap on the ground. Standing over him, his feet planted firm, was the Methodist minister, George D. Baker. His face was not one of rage or panic, but of grim, unyielding determination. The hand that had baptized children and offered the communion wafer now held a smoking pistol. He had shot and killed the Clay County clerk in broad daylight in the very heart of town, and he made no move to run. The battle was over. In the terrible silence that followed, the only thing left to do was count the cost. After the chaos of the courthouse square, the story moves indoors into the quiet, methodical world of paper and ink. I'm sitting in a county records office, a place where human dramas are boiled down into simple, declarative sentences written in the elegant, spidery script of the past. In my hands, I have a copy of the coroner's inquest for Thomas Howard, dated November 1899. It's a document of brutal efficiency. Under cause of death, the physician wrote just 2 words. Pistol shot. 2 words. That's all the official record has to say about the violent end of a man's life. It doesn't mention the generations of animosity, the public insults, or the look of shock on his face as he fell. The paper reduces the entire complex, bloody feud into a simple clinical fact. It strips away the passion, the hatred, and the honor, leaving only the sterile mechanics of the event. This is the first step in the law's attempt to make sense of the unthinkable. Then there's the sheriff's logbook entry for that day. It's just as lean. George D. Baker surrendered himself into my custody this afternoon, states he shot Thomas Howard in self-defense after being threatened. Here it is, the moment the story pivots. The raw, violent act on the street is immediately being framed, packaged into a legal defense. Self-defense. In the world of bloody clay, those two words carried an immense weight, a meaning far deeper than any law book could define. Reading these documents, you realize the official record is a different language. It has no words for the code of the mountains. It cannot record the weight of an insult or the sacred duty to kin. All the raw human emotion that led to the shooting is invisible here. These papers tell you what happened, but they are utterly silent on the why. And it was in that vast, silent space between the facts on the page and the truth of the feud that the fate of Reverend George D. Baker would be decided. There was no manhunt for Reverend Baker. He did not flee into the mountains or attempt to hide among his kin. In a move that demonstrated a deep understanding of the local power dynamics, he walked calmly from the scene of the shooting, his pistol likely still warm, and surrendered himself to the sheriff. He knew the fight had not ended. It had simply moved into a new arena, the courtroom. He was gambling that the same code of honor that led him to pull the trigger would be the very thing that set him free. The trial of the killer preacher was a sensation. It drew crowds from all over the surrounding counties, packing the small Manchester courthouse to the rafters. On one side of the room sat the somber, black-clad family of Tom Howard, their faces etched with grief and a thirst for vengeance. On the other side sat the Bakers and their allies, a formidable wall of support for their preacher and kinsman. The entire Clay County feud was condensed into that one superheated room, the air thick with tension and the unspoken threat of more violence. The prosecution presented a clear, logical case. They argued that this was a premeditated assassination, the culmination of a political and personal vendetta. They had witnesses who saw the confrontation. They had the body of the county clerk as their star exhibit. They argued that a man of God, of all people, should have turned the other cheek. It was a solid case, built on the foundation of state law and Christian morality. But Baker's defense was not built on the law of Kentucky. It was built on the law of the mountains. His lawyers didn't deny he pulled the trigger. Instead, they painted a picture of a good man pushed to the brink. They brought witness after witness to testify about Tom Howard's aggressive nature and the public threats he had made against the Reverend's life. Baker himself took the stand, a commanding and sympathetic figure. He spoke not of politics, but of the primal fear for his life. He claimed that when he met Howard on the square, he saw a man ready to kill him, and in the kill or be killed world they all inhabited, he had no choice but to shoot first. The jury, 12 men from Clay and the surrounding hills, listened intently. They were not just jurors. They were men who lived by the same code. They understood the weight of a public threat, the unforgivable nature of certain insults. They were being asked to judge George Baker not by the cold letter of the law, but by the unwritten rules of survival and honor that governed their own lives. When the time came, the verdict was delivered to a silent, packed courtroom. Not guilty. Reverend George D. Baker had killed a man, and his peers had declared it justice. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, leaving the family of Tom Howard to wonder if there was any law in Kentucky that could touch a Baker. The final chapter of any feud isn't written in a courthouse ledger or a yellowed newspaper. It's written here, in a quiet mountain cemetery where the only sounds are the wind in the cedar trees and the crunch of your own feet on the gravel path. The stones here are old, tilted by the slow creep of the earth, their inscriptions worn smooth by a century of rain and snow. This is where the passions of bloody Clay came for their final, silent rest. It takes some searching to find Tom Howard. His stone is in a family plot, a solid, respectable granite marker befitting a man of his station. The inscription is fading now, but you can still make out his name and his title. Clay County Clerk. It's a final, silent testament to the power he once held. The stone is weathered, clean, but not meticulously tended. It feels like a monument to a past that is slowly, surely being forgotten. Here lies a man who lost the most important fight of his life, and the quiet dignity of his grave seems to echo that defeat. Then, just over a small rise, on the other side of the cemetery, you find the Baker family plot. And there it is. Reverend George D. Baker's stone is simpler, more humble, marked with a plain cross. It's the grave of a minister, not a warrior. But there's a key difference here. The ground around it is clearer, and a small, faded plastic flower sits at its base, a sign that someone still comes to remember. His legacy, it seems, has lingered in a way that Howard's has not. They lie maybe 200 feet from one another. All the fury, the power struggles, the public condemnations, and the final fatal violence on the courthouse square, it all ends here. They are neighbors now, enemies in life who share the same quiet Kentucky soil in death. But leaving that courthouse a free man was not the end of the story. For the Reverend, for his family, and for the shattered family of the man he killed, acquittal was not the same as peace. A new, long shadow was just beginning to fall. Freedom, in bloody Clay County, was a complicated thing. When Reverend George D. Baker walked out of that courthouse, acquitted and unbowed, he wasn't returning to a life of quiet ministry. He was returning to a war that he had just won a major battle in. The law had exonerated him, but the feud was far from over. The long shadow of the man he killed would follow him, and the entire county, for years to come. The most powerful legend about the killer preacher, the one that still sends a shiver down the spine, is what happened the very next Sunday. He ascended to his pulpit, as he always did. The church was filled to overflowing, a tense mix of his loyal Baker kin and other townsfolk, all watching, waiting to see what the man who had killed another just days before would have to say. He opened his Bible, looked out over the congregation, and his voice boomed with the same fire and conviction as always. He did not preach of mercy or forgiveness. He preached from the Old Testament, a fiery sermon about righteous justice, about smiting one's enemies, about the sacred duty to protect one's own from the forces of evil. He didn't need to name Tom Howard. Every soul in that room knew who the Philistine was in his sermon. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was claiming divine justification. For the Howard family, the acquittal was not an ending, but a declaration of war. The legal system had failed them, siding with their enemy. In their eyes, the verdict was a profound and unforgivable insult, proof that the Bakers owned the law in Clay County. The grief for their fallen leader curdled into a cold, hard resolve. They were now bound by honor to seek their own justice. The feud did not die with Tom Howard. His death became a rallying cry, a martyr's blood that guaranteed the violence would continue for another generation. And so, Clay County did not find peace. The acquittal hardened the battle lines. The Bakers and their allies were emboldened, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. The Howards and their supporters were driven by a fresh, burning sense of grievance. The violence sputtered on, in ambushes on lonely roads and sudden confrontations in town. The long shadow of that courthouse showdown poisoned the community, ensuring that sons would inherit the hatreds of their fathers. Reverend George D. Baker, for his part, continued to preach. He lived for many more years, a respected elder in his clan and a pillar of his church. He died an old man, a living paradox, who never seemed to have been troubled by the two halves of his life. To his flock and his family, he remained a man of God who had been forced to defend himself. He was the shepherd who, to protect his flock, had been forced to kill a wolf. The story of his life, however, would serve as a dark and permanent reminder that in the mountains, the law of God and the law of man could both be bent to the will of the feud. Even today, more than 100 years after the smoke cleared on the courthouse square, the story of the killer preacher is not a settled piece of history in Clay County. It's a living wound. The feud itself may have faded, but its memory has split into two powerful, irreconcilable currents that still flow through the community. The truth, you see, depends entirely on which side of the cemetery you're standing on. If you talk to folks with Baker blood, or those whose families were allied with them, a clear picture emerges. To them, Reverend George D. Baker remains a pillar of strength and conviction. He was a man of God, yes, but he was also a man of his time and place, forced to defend his very life against a corrupt and violent political enemy. In their telling, the acquittal wasn't a miscarriage of justice. It was the will of the community, a righteous verdict for a man who had been pushed too far. He is remembered as a hero, a symbol of the unbreakable bond of family and the courage to stand against tyranny. But if you find someone with a connection to the Howard clan, you will hear a different gospel entirely. They will tell you the story of a cold-blooded hypocrite who hid a killer's heart behind the cloth of the ministry. They'll speak of a political assassination, carefully planned and brutally executed, disguised as a chance street fight. To them, Tom Howard was a duly elected public servant, a husband and a father, murdered for standing up to the Bakers' control of the county. The trial was a sham, the verdict a final bitter insult delivered by a jury of their enemies' friends. In this version, Reverend Baker is no hero. He is the villain, a man who twisted both the law of man and the word of God to get away with murder. So who was he? A righteous man of God or a sanctimonious killer? Was Tom Howard a dangerous aggressor or a public servant trying to do his job? The absolute objective truth of what was in each man's heart on that day is likely buried with them under those worn granite stones. What remains are these two opposing legacies, two powerful stories passed down through generations. The feud is over, but the battle for how it is remembered rages on in the quiet conversations and the long memories of these mountains. When a story is this raw, this soaked in blood and betrayal and impossible choices, it refuses to stay dead and buried in the past. It breaks free from the brittle pages of history books and the sworn testimony of court records. It seeps into the soil of the place where it happened, and over the decades, it grows into something else entirely, a legend. The story of Reverend George D. Baker is no longer just a historical event in Clay County. It's a piece of local folklore. It has become a cautionary tale, the kind a grandfather might tell his grandson to explain the dark complexities of the world. It's a warning that a man's character is never simple, that even a man of God can carry a killer's resolve in his heart. It's the ultimate Appalachian parable, a stark reminder that in these mountains, the bonds of blood can sometimes be stronger than the bonds of faith, and that blood is often thicker than holy water. And like all powerful stories of violence, it left a ghost behind. Some people in Manchester will tell you that on a cold, quiet November evening, if you stand in just the right spot on the courthouse square, you can feel it. A sudden drop in temperature, a cold spot where the air seems heavier, more sorrowful. Others claim to have heard things on the wind, not a voice, but the faint echo of a heated argument, followed by a terrible, profound silence. It is the psychic scar left on the landscape, the final transformation of the killer preacher's story from a human tragedy into a haunting. This is what happens when history bleeds into legend. The sharp edges of fact, the exact words spoken, the precise sequence of events get worn smooth over time. What's left is the dark, unsettling truth at the heart of the tale. That the line between a saint and a sinner, a hero and a murderer, can sometimes be as thin as a trigger pull. So here we are, back where we began, on the courthouse square in Manchester. The place hasn't changed in the last hour of our journey, but our understanding of it has. The echo I spoke of when we started is clearer now. It's no longer a vague feeling in the air. It has a voice. It speaks of honor and insult, of faith and fury, of a man who tried to hold both a Bible and a pistol and found himself forced to choose which one to use. We came here with a simple, shocking question. How does a preacher become a killer? But the story of Reverend George D. Baker and Tom Howard teaches us that the truth is never simple. It's a dark and tangled web of old wounds from a forgotten war, the brutal pride of the clan, and the impossible pressure cooker of a community where the law of the gun often spoke louder than the law of the land. We saw how a verdict of not guilty didn't bring peace, but only guaranteed that the long shadow of violence would stretch into a new generation. And this story, in the end, isn't just about a feud in the Kentucky mountains over a century ago. It's a chilling lesson about the fragility of civilization itself. It shows us how quickly our highest ideals, our faith, our laws, our sense of morality can be swept away by older, deeper currents of blood, honor, and revenge. The story of the killer preacher is a permanent and powerful reminder that the most dangerous ground isn't in some distant, lawless hollow, but in the conflicted heart of a human being. The men who lived and died by that code are gone now. The old courthouse they fought to control is nothing but a memory. But the next time you pass through a small town and see its courthouse square, listen. Listen for the echoes of the stories that ground is holding on to. The people are gone, the guns are silent, but the story remains. In the autumn of 1806, a stunning proclamation from President Thomas Jefferson sent a shockwave across the young United States. It warned of a conspiracy, a secret expedition of armed men forming on the western rivers with a purpose unfriendly to the peace of the Union. It called for the immediate arrest of the plot's ringleader, a man whose name was known in every household from the drawing rooms of Philadelphia to the log cabins of the frontier, former Vice President Aaron Burr. The news was unthinkable. This was a man who had stood just one heartbeat from the presidency, a hero of the revolution, a founder of the nation. Now he was a fugitive, accused of the ultimate crime, treason. What had happened? What dark ambition could drive a man of such stature to raise a private army in the Appalachian wilderness? Was he a patriot preparing for a secret war against Spain, or a would-be emperor plotting to shatter the fragile American Republic and carve out his own kingdom in the West? Today, we will become detectives of the past, sifting through the forgotten clues of this grand and shadowy plot to finally answer the question, who was the real Aaron Burr? To understand the tragedy that unfolded, you first have to understand the world that was at risk. Not just the lives of a few men, but the very soul of a young nation. In 1805, the United States was less a single unified country and more a fragile alliance between the settled, powerful East and the wild, restless West. The Appalachian Mountains were the great dividing line, and the people who lived in their shadow felt like a nation unto themselves. They were veterans paid in land they had to fight for, Scots-Irish settlers who bowed to no authority but their own, and pioneers who saw the federal government not as a protector, but as a distant collection of politicians who neither understood nor cared about their struggles. Their lifeline, the mighty Mississippi River, was choked off at its mouth by the Spanish, who held New Orleans. To them, the Union felt like a promise broken. At the heart of this volatile frontier, there was a literal paradise, a place that symbolized everything that stood to be lost. On an island in the Ohio River, a wealthy Irish aristocrat named Harmon Blennerhassett had built a dream. Fleeing scandal in Europe, he and his brilliant wife, Margaret, had constructed a stunning white mansion, a beacon of European culture in the American wilderness. It was filled with telescopes, lavish libraries, and fine art. From its portico, one could hear music and scientific debate instead of the cry of the panther. Blennerhassett was a dreamer, a romantic, a man more at home with a chemistry experiment than a rifle. He sought a life of refined intellectual peace, far from the intrigues of the old world. His wife, Margaret, was his equal in every way, a poet, an accomplished horsewoman, and a gracious host who made their island a legendary oasis of hospitality. They had 2 young sons and a fortune they believed was secure. Their world was one of beauty, science, and domestic tranquility, an idyllic existence carved right out of the rugged frontier. They were not the only ones with a stake in the future. All along the river valleys, thousands of families had gambled everything on this new land. They had cleared the forests, fought off disease, and planted their hopes in the rich, dark soil. Their lives were hard, their dreams simple: to own their land, to provide for their children, and to have a say in their own destiny. They were a proud, tough, and deeply dissatisfied people, their hearts filled with a simmering resentment against the East and a burning hunger for the opportunities they believed lay just beyond the horizon. This, then, was the world that existed before the serpent entered the garden. A fragile nation, a perfect island paradise, and a populace of hardy frontiersmen, all vulnerable in their own ways. They were a collection of dreamers, idealists, and fighters, unknowingly waiting for a charismatic leader to ignite their passions and lead them toward a new destiny or toward their own destruction. The crime, in this case, was not discovered with a single gunshot or a body in a ravine. It was discovered in pieces, a slow dawning horror that spread through the Appalachian territories like a fever. The crime scene was the entire Ohio River Valley, and the clues were not stains of blood, but the sounds of hammers and the whispers of restless men. The epicenter of it all was Harmon Blennerhassett's idyllic island. The once peaceful estate had been transformed. The music and philosophical debates were replaced by the ring of blacksmiths' anvils and the thud of axes. Locals paddling past the island in their skiffs saw things that made no sense. A fleet of 15 massive keelboats was being constructed, far more than any group of simple settlers would need. Harmon Blennerhassett, the gentle scholar, had turned the grand halls of his mansion into a workshop, using his fireplaces to kiln dry the wood for the boats. Huge quantities of supplies were being stockpiled: barrels of pork, sacks of flour, and casks of whiskey, enough to sustain an army, not a handful of families heading to a new farm. The most unsettling clues were the men themselves. Young, rootless, and ambitious men from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky began to gather on the island. They weren't farmers. They carried new rifles and spoke not of planting seasons, but of adventure and glory. When questioned, they were evasive, offering a sly grin and a vague promise of riches to be won in the South. The story changed depending on who was telling it. Some said they were off to settle the Bastrop Tract, a massive land grant in Texas. Others winked and spoke of a secret government mission to fight the Spanish. The scene spoke of a grand conspiracy unfolding in plain sight, yet its true purpose remained maddeningly obscure. Was this an elaborate land speculation, as Burr publicly claimed? Or was it the secret mobilization of a patriot army waiting for the president's signal to march on Spanish territory? Or was it something far darker, the birth of a rebel force preparing to turn its guns on its own country? The wilderness offered no easy answers, only a multitude of unsettling questions that grew louder with every plank nailed into place. At the center of this storm of rumor and preparation stood one man, the obvious and immediate suspect: Aaron Burr. This was not some backwoods rabble-rouser. This was a political giant, a fallen angel of the Republic. By 1805, Burr was a political ghost, a man whose career had been immolated in the fires of scandal. As vice president, he had been sidelined and distrusted by Thomas Jefferson. Then came the final, fatal blow, his duel with Alexander Hamilton. By killing his great rival, Burr had made himself a pariah in the East, a man reviled in the very halls of power he had once commanded. His motive, whispered from the taverns of Pittsburgh to the halls of Congress, was not simple greed, but something far more potent: a burning desire for revenge. This entire Western enterprise was seen as a grand and audacious act of personal vengeance against the nation and the man who had cast him out. Burr felt betrayed by the American political system, and his ambition was to build a new empire in the West, so powerful and glorious that it would dwarf the United States. He would show Jefferson, he would show all of them, what a mistake they had made. To the people in the East, his actions weren't about settling land. They were about settling a score. The initial evidence was Burr himself, and the godlike manner in which he traveled through the wilderness. He journeyed down the Ohio not in a humble canoe, but on a magnificent 60-foot barge, a floating mansion complete with a dining hall and wine cellar. Imagine the spectacle, this vessel of Eastern luxury gliding past the rough log cabins of the frontier. It was a statement of power and intent, the procession of a king, not the humble transport of a pioneer. Whispers followed him everywhere, born of his almost hypnotic personal charm. Witnesses described a man with piercing dark eyes who could hold a room captive with his words. He didn't just ask for support, he seduced men into his vision. He made every farmer, every militia captain, every wealthy planter feel as though they were the single most important person to the success of his grand and secret enterprise. The sheer number of influential men who flocked to his banner was damning evidence in itself. From the moment his grand barge appeared on the river, there was no doubt who the leader was. Every rifle purchased, every boat built, every secret oath sworn in the dead of night pointed directly back to one man, the disgraced Vice President, Aaron Burr. But as grand as Burr's ambition was, he wasn't acting alone. He couldn't be. To seize New Orleans and control the West, he needed more than a few dozen frontiersmen in keelboats. He needed a military man on the inside, a powerful ally who could deliver the U.S. Army itself into his hands. He had such a partner, a man whose position made the entire scheme seem not just possible, but destined for success. General James Wilkinson, the commanding general of the entire United States Army and the governor of the Louisiana Territory. He was Burr's most trusted confidant, his co-conspirator, the sword that would carve out their new empire. And here, my friends, is where the story twists from a simple tale of ambition into a shadowy labyrinth of deceit. For what no one in Burr's inner circle knew, what the frontiersmen flocking to his banner could never have imagined, was that General Wilkinson, the highest-ranking soldier in the United States, was living a lie. For years, he had been a secret agent on the payroll of the Spanish government, known to his handlers only as Agent 13. Wilkinson's loyalty was not to Aaron Burr, nor was it to President Jefferson. His true master was himself, and his motive was a toxic cocktail of greed and a desperate instinct for self-preservation. He was playing the most dangerous game imaginable, promising support to Burr's conspiracy while feeding information to his Spanish masters, all while maintaining his position as America's top general. With this horrifying truth in mind, all of Wilkinson's actions snap into a darker focus. His letters to Burr, filled with encouragement and bold promises of delivering New Orleans, were not the communications of a loyal partner. They were the calculated words of a master manipulator, luring Burr deeper and deeper into the trap. He fanned the flames of Burr's ambition, assuring him that the army was ready, that the Creole population of New Orleans would welcome him as a liberator. Each promise was another thread in the web he was weaving around his supposed friend. His apparent support was pure theater, a performance for an audience of one. Re-examined, every action reeks of a darker truth. Wilkinson was not helping Burr build an empire. He was helping him build a gallows. He waited, letting Burr invest his money, his reputation, and the lives of his followers. He let the conspiracy grow just large enough to be a credible threat, all the while holding an axe over its neck, positioning himself to be the hero who would eventually save the very nation he was helping to endanger. The greatest threat to Aaron Burr wasn't the president in Washington, but the trusted brother-in-arms standing right beside him. But the conspiracy wasn't just a drama between American titans. The Appalachian frontier was not some isolated stage. It was the explosive friction point between competing empires, a grand chessboard where the players were not just ambitious individuals, but entire nations. Beyond the personal vendettas and internal betrayals, there was a third looming force at play, the shadowy hand of foreign powers, particularly Great Britain and Spain. They were the external threat, the silent partners whose interests stood to be served by chaos on the American frontier. Their motives were as cold and impersonal as they were powerful. Great Britain, still stinging from its defeat in the Revolution, saw in Burr's plan a golden opportunity to fracture and weaken its upstart rival. A new, independent Western Republic, hostile to the United States and friendly to the Crown, would be a strategic masterstroke. It would halt American expansion and give Britain effective control over the Mississippi River and the heart of the continent. The British minister in Washington, Anthony Merry, listened with great interest to Burr's proposals, seeing a chance to undo the results of the war. Spain, on the other hand, was a crumbling empire motivated by pure fear. They looked at the aggressive, land-hungry American frontiersmen pouring over the Appalachians and saw an existential threat to their most valuable colonial possession, silver-rich Mexico. For the Spanish, Burr's plot was both a terrifying danger and a potential solution. A successful invasion would be a catastrophe, but a civil war that turned Americans against each other could keep them occupied for decades, protecting the Spanish border through mutual destruction. This foreign meddling created a poisonous paranoia that seeped into every settlement along the river. Who could be trusted? Locals spoke of well-dressed strangers with European accents appearing in frontier taverns, men with heavy coin purses and too many questions. Rumors spread that the incredible sums of money funding Burr's expedition were not coming from his own ruined fortune, but from the coffers of a foreign king. This wasn't just a domestic rebellion anymore. It was an international intrigue, and the hardy folk of Appalachia were being courted, manipulated, and used as pawns in a game whose rules they didn't understand, by forces whose ultimate loyalty was to a distant throne. The initial pursuit of Aaron Burr was not a chase through the mountains, but a maddening hunt through a wilderness of lies. Burr, a master of political intrigue, had constructed a labyrinth of false trails and red herrings so brilliant that it paralyzed his enemies and confused his friends. The investigation, led from a distance by a deeply worried President Jefferson, repeatedly crashed against the wall of Burr's plausible deniability. The most powerful of these false trails was the public and seemingly legitimate one, the settlement of the Bastrop Tract. Burr had purchased a massive disputed land claim on the Ouachita River in what is now Louisiana. To the world, he was simply the leader of a land company, gathering brave pioneers to build a new life in the West. It was the perfect cover. Every boat built, every barrel of flour purchased, every man recruited could be explained away as a necessary preparation for this grand, legal settlement. When local officials came snooping, they were shown land deeds and contracts. Burr would greet them with the disarming charm of a respectable businessman, asking, "Gentlemen, is it now a crime in this republic to seek one's fortune?" The lead would go cold. For those who weren't satisfied by the simple story of a land venture, Burr had a more intoxicating bait, the patriot's cloak. He would take a man like Andrew Jackson aside and in a low, confidential tone hint that this entire expedition was a secret plan, tacitly approved by the administration in Washington. War with Spain was imminent, he'd suggest, and his force of hardy frontiersmen was meant to be the vanguard of the American army, ready to seize Texas or even Mexico the moment hostilities began. This masterstroke of misdirection turned potential accusers into enthusiastic allies. How could you arrest a man who was carrying out the president's secret orders? Back in Washington, Thomas Jefferson was wrestling with shadows. The reports that reached him were a maddening torrent of contradictions. One letter would paint Burr as a traitorous madman, the next as a misunderstood patriot. The vastness of the Appalachian frontier swallowed the truth. Messengers took weeks to travel, and by the time Jefferson could act on a piece of intelligence, the situation on the ground had already changed. He dispatched agents to the Ohio, but they too became lost in the fog of rumor. The investigation was dying a death of 1,000 dead ends. The posse would gather, ready to act on a damning rumor, only to find Burr had already sailed downriver, leaving behind a camp of men who swore they were just simple farmers. Promising leads evaporated in the Appalachian mist. This growing frustration in Washington and the rising confusion on the frontier was exactly what Burr intended. His campaign of misdirection was his greatest weapon, allowing his conspiracy to grow in plain sight, shielded by a brilliant wilderness of lies. President Jefferson's agents quickly discovered they were not just fighting against Aaron Burr, they were fighting against the entire culture of the Appalachian frontier. When they arrived in the bustling river towns and isolated homesteads to ask questions, they were met with a wall of silence, as thick and impenetrable as the mountain laurel. Doors were politely shut in their faces. Men in taverns would suddenly fall quiet, turning to stare into their mugs of ale. Neighbors who saw everything suddenly saw nothing. Those who heard the feverish preparations heard only the wind in the trees. You see, this was not the silence of simple ignorance. It was a deliberate collective act of defiance born from a deep and abiding distrust of the federal government. To these people, the men from Washington were the outsiders, the tax collectors, the agents of Eastern bankers who held their land titles. Aaron Burr, by contrast, was one of them. He was a war hero, a man of action, an enemy of the very Eastern elite they despised. Asking a Kentucky farmer to betray Aaron Burr to a federal agent was like asking him to side with the fox against his own hounds. It went against the grain of his very soul. This silence was also rooted in a shared dream. Burr wasn't just selling a conspiracy, he was selling hope. His vision of a Western empire, of conquering the riches of Mexico, became their vision. Their sons and brothers were the young men signing up for the expedition. Their crops were feeding the recruits, their whiskey filling the barrels on the boats. The entire region was complicit, bound together by a web of kinship, commerce, and a mutual gamble on a glorious future. To speak against Burr was to speak against their own community, against their own aspirations, and against the prospect of a better life that felt, for the first time, within their grasp. The psychological toll on anyone who considered breaking the code was immense. A man who voiced his doubts about Burr at the local store might find himself ostracized, his credit suddenly no good. A ferryman who reported the movement of armed men might find his boat mysteriously cut adrift in the night. There was no need for overt threats. The fear of retribution was a cold, unspoken understanding. In a land where a man's survival depended on his neighbors, isolation was a death sentence. And so, the people saw nothing, heard nothing, and said nothing, creating a perfect, silent incubator where treason could grow in the open air. For months, the conspiracy had been protected by Burr's masterful deceptions and the frontier's code of silence. But the turning point, the clue that finally broke the case wide open, did not come from a dusty attic or a deathbed confession. It came in a sealed dispatch, carried by military courier across hundreds of miles of wilderness, penned by the hand of the conspiracy's most important architect. The clue was a letter, and the man who wrote it was General James Wilkinson. Stationed in Louisiana, far from the prying eyes of the East, Wilkinson played his double game as long as he could. But by the late autumn of 1806, he realized the plot was faltering. The expected money from Britain hadn't arrived, recruitment was slower than hoped, and President Jefferson was growing more suspicious by the day. Wilkinson saw that the ship was sinking, and he decided his best move was not just to jump, but to set the entire vessel on fire and claim the reward for sounding the alarm. He chose a side, and it was his own. The letter that arrived on President Jefferson's desk was a masterpiece of calculated treachery. To save himself, Wilkinson had to portray Burr as the greatest villain the Republic had ever known, and himself as the loyal soldier who had uncovered the plot. He laid out the conspiracy in the most terrifying terms imaginable. He spoke of a plan to seize New Orleans, rob the banks, incite a civil war, and create a Western empire with Burr on the throne. He painted Burr not as a mere adventurer, but as an American Napoleon, a devil whose ambition threatened the very existence of the United States. This letter was the forgotten clue that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The word of a traitor. For Jefferson, it was the moment of horrifying clarity. The fog of rumor was instantly burned away. The contradictory reports, the whispers, the vague warnings, they were all replaced by this one damning account from the highest-ranking general in the army. The labyrinth of lies that Burr had so carefully constructed collapsed in an instant. The letter changed everything. There was no more room for doubt, no more need for cautious investigation. The threat was real, it was imminent, and its full, treasonous scope was finally laid bare. A renewed and terrible urgency seized the capital. The time for waiting was over. The time for action was now. The moment Jefferson broke the seal on that letter, the game was over, and the manhunt was about to begin. With Wilkinson's damning letter in hand, President Thomas Jefferson acted. He issued a presidential proclamation that swept down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers like a flood, a single sheet of paper that tore away the web of lies and unmasked Aaron Burr before the entire nation. The proclamation ordered all civil and military officers to seize the illegal expedition, its boats, its supplies, and its leader. There was no more ambiguity, no more talk of secret government plans or peaceful settlement. The President of the United States had officially branded Aaron Burr a traitor. The news shattered the conspiracy. For the young men gathered on Blennerhassett Island and in camps along the river, the unmasking was a moment of brutal awakening. The dream of Mexican silver and grand adventure evaporated, replaced by the cold, stark reality of treason. They weren't patriots in waiting. They were outlaws, fugitives in their own country. The cause they had pledged their lives to was revealed as a criminal enterprise. And what was the true plot? The one hidden beneath all the layers of deceit. The forgotten clues, the letters between the conspirators, and Wilkinson's own self-serving confession finally revealed the chilling truth. Burr's plan was a masterpiece of flexible ambition. The first step was to lead his army of frontiersmen to New Orleans. He would seize the city, its federal arsenal, and its treasury. From there, his options would open up. If the moment was right, he would persuade the western states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, to secede from the Union and form a new Western empire with himself as its head. If secession proved difficult, he would use the captured funds and weapons to launch his own private invasion of Spanish Mexico, conquering its silver mines and crowning himself Emperor Aaron I. His motive was a volcanic mixture of personal revenge and grandiose destiny. Scorned by the nation he had helped to build, he sought to create a new one in his own image, a vigorous, martial empire free from the constraints of Jeffersonian democracy. He saw himself not as a traitor, but as a new Napoleon, a man of action destined to forge a continent. But as Burr was unmasked as a traitor to his country, a second, more profound unmasking was taking place in the shadows of history. The man who brought him down, General James Wilkinson, was revealed to be a traitor of a different order. He was a man who betrayed everyone. He betrayed Spain by plotting with Burr. He betrayed Burr by exposing him to Jefferson. And he betrayed the United States by serving as a paid foreign agent while commanding its armies. The Great Burr Conspiracy was not ultimately foiled by loyal patriots. It was cannibalized from within, brought down by the successful treachery of its second-in-command, a man whose only motive was his own survival and profit. This was the final, ugly truth. The plot to create a new empire was destroyed by an even deeper, more personal betrayal. The president's words fell upon the frontier not like rain, but like shards of ice. The proclamation, spreading from rider to rider, shattered the grand conspiracy in 1,000 pieces. On Blennerhassett Island, the heart of the enterprise, the dream died in a single night of chaos. The Virginia militia descended not upon a disciplined military camp, but upon a confused and terrified group of men who now understood they had been betrayed. With Burr and Blennerhassett already downriver, The abandoned recruits, their hopes of glory and riches turned to ash, unleashed their fury on the paradise that had lured them in. Through the eyes of Margaret Blennerhassett, who had been left behind, paradise was lost in a symphony of destruction. She didn't see a battle, she heard the end of a world. She heard the splintering crash of fine cherrywood as elegant furniture was broken apart. The air filled with the sharp, sickening sound of shattering Venetian glass and the reek of whiskey spilled on priceless Persian rugs. She heard the drunken shouts of men she had once fed at her own table, their voices no longer filled with hope, but with a bitter, aimless rage. In the main hall, dark, ragged holes began to appear in the fine linen draperies, the silent witnesses of a dream being shot to pieces. Forced to flee with her children into the freezing December night, her only transport was an open riverboat. As it was pushed out into the icy current, she looked back at her magnificent home, its windows blazing with light, not from a joyous party, but from the fires set within by the rampaging men. The world had turned into a hell of screams, followed by a ringing silence as her home, her dream, and her future were consumed by the darkness. Miles downriver, Aaron Burr himself heard the news of Wilkinson's betrayal and Jefferson's proclamation. The unmasking was absolute. In an instant, his grand design crumbled. The man who dreamed of an emperor's throne was now forced into the disguise of a common boatman, hoping to slip through the net that was closing around him. He became a fugitive, his flight a desperate scramble toward the Spanish territory in Florida. The end came not in a blaze of glory on a battlefield, but in a muddy swamp in the backwoods of what is now Alabama. He was not cornered in a heroic last stand. He was simply recognized by his aristocratic bearing and his fine, elegant boots, mired in the filth. The would-be emperor was captured without a single shot being fired. The Grand Western Army was no more. The boats were impounded, the men scattered to the winds, and the beautiful mansion on the island stood silent and ravaged, a monument to a spectacular failure. The conspiracy was over, ending not with a bang, but with the hollow echo of a dream breaking. Aaron Burr was brought to Richmond, Virginia, to stand trial for treason, and what followed was not merely a legal proceeding, but a political war waged in a courtroom. It was a spectacle that gripped the entire nation. In one corner stood President Thomas Jefferson, consumed with a burning, almost personal need to see his old rival hanged. In the other corner sat the judge, the formidable Chief Justice John Marshall, a man who was not only Jefferson's political enemy, but also his cousin. And at the center of it all was Aaron Burr, who, far from being a broken-down prisoner, acted as his own lead counsel, his brilliant legal mind as sharp and dangerous as ever. The atmosphere in Richmond was electric. The city swelled with crowds, a chaotic mix of statesmen, lawyers, frontiersmen who had come to testify, and curious onlookers eager for a glimpse of the great traitor. The prosecution, backed by the full power of the presidency, presented a mountain of evidence detailing Burr's grand ambitions and military preparations. Jefferson himself from Washington attempted to micromanage the case, convinced that the very survival of the Republic depended on a guilty verdict. But Chief Justice Marshall saw the trial through a different lens. He saw the danger not just from Burr's ambition, but from a president willing to bend the law to destroy a political foe. Marshall stood firm on a strict, narrow definition of treason as laid out in the Constitution itself. He instructed the jury that to be guilty of treason, a person must commit an overt act of war against the United States. Simply plotting to do so, gathering men, or speaking of empire was not enough. The prosecution had to prove that Burr's army had actually levied war, which of course it never had. There had been no battle, no shots fired at American troops. The president's fury was immense, but the Chief Justice would not yield. Trapped by this strict constitutional standard, the prosecution's case collapsed. They could prove intent, they could prove conspiracy, but they could not prove an overt act of war. After all the drama, all the testimony, and all the political maneuvering, the jury returned its verdict: not guilty. Aaron Burr, The man who dreamed of empire and set the entire West ablaze walked out of the courtroom a free man. The verdict was a stunning legal victory, but a profound moral failure in the eyes of many. Jefferson was enraged, the public was bewildered, and the frontiersmen who had followed Burr were left ruined and betrayed. While legally innocent of treason, Burr was found guilty in the court of public opinion. He was a free man, but his name was forever destroyed, his honor gone. The verdict, a landmark in American law, remains controversial to this day. A verdict that still sparks arguments in these hills about whether justice was truly served, or if the greatest traitor of them all simply got away with it. The storm of the Burr conspiracy had passed, but the wreckage was strewn across a generation. Though acquitted, Aaron Burr was a ruined man. He became a living ghost, a specter of his former self, ostracized from the country he had once helped to lead. He spent years in self-imposed exile in Europe, still scheming, still trying to find a foreign monarch to back his imperial dreams, but he was a man without a country and without credibility. He eventually returned to America and spent his final decades as an obscure lawyer in New York City, haunted by the shadows of what might have been. The man who dreamed of an emperor's throne died in relative poverty, his name forever synonymous not with founder, but with traitor. For Harmon and Margaret Blennerhassett, the dream had become a permanent nightmare. Their island paradise was a memory, their mansion a looted shell, their fortune gone. Harmon was arrested and spent months in a Richmond prison before the charges were dropped in the wake of Burr's acquittal. But his freedom was a hollow victory. Hounded by debt and disgrace, the couple wandered for years, from Mississippi to Canada to the Caribbean, trying to rebuild their lives, but they never recovered. Harmon died in poverty, and Margaret's final years were spent petitioning a Congress that had long forgotten her for some compensation for their ruined home. The idyllic life they had built in the wilderness was the first and most tragic casualty of Burr's ambition. But not everyone was destroyed. In Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, the fiery general who had been so taken with Burr, emerged from the scandal not only unscathed, but strengthened. He had been cautious, demanding proof that Burr's plans were sanctioned by the government. When that proof never came, and Wilkinson's betrayal was revealed, Jackson swiftly and publicly distanced himself from the plot, positioning himself as a loyal patriot who had been misled. The affair taught him a valuable lesson in political survival and reinforced his reputation as a shrewd and decisive leader. His brush with Burr's treason did nothing to slow his own meteoric rise to power. And the arch-traitor himself, General James Wilkinson, the man who had betrayed Spain, Burr, and the United States, he was never held to account. Despite a congressional investigation that uncovered his long history as a Spanish spy, he was exonerated, his web of lies and influence proving too thick to penetrate. He retained his command, continued his career, and died years later, the ultimate survivor of the web of lies he himself had spun. His fate was perhaps the story's bitterest lesson, that in the murky world of power, the greatest crimes are sometimes the ones that go unpunished. Even now, more than 2 centuries later, the traces of this grand and failed dream have not vanished from the land. The conspiracy is not just a story in a history book, it is a scar left on the map of Appalachia, a memory etched into the landscape itself. If you travel today to a small island in the Ohio River near Parkersburg, West Virginia, you can step right into the heart of the story. Blennerhassett Island is now a state park. The magnificent Palladian mansion, destroyed by fire and the passage of time, has been meticulously reconstructed, its white columns rising once more from the wilderness. You can walk through its halls and stand on its portico, looking out at the same river that once carried Burr's ambitions, and it is almost impossible not to feel the ghosts of that hopeful, tragic autumn. But the island is not the only place the memory lives on. It lingers in the old stories, in the local folklore of the river valley. For generations after Burr fled, treasure hunters would search the caves and hollows along the Ohio, They were looking for Burr's lost treasure, chests of Spanish silver and gold that legend says he was forced to bury when he became a fugitive. No great treasure was ever found, of course, but the myth itself is a powerful echo of the original promise that lured men to his banner. The dream of unimaginable wealth, a shortcut to a better life, buried just beneath the Appalachian soil. The land itself has not forgotten. The Ohio River, the great artery of the conspiracy, still flows past the same towns, Marietta, Parkersburg, Cincinnati, that once buzzed with whispers of the coming expedition. Standing on its banks today, watching the slow-moving barges, it is easy to imagine the sight of Burr's keelboats filled with armed men slipping past in the pre-dawn mist on their way toward a destiny they could not yet see. The river remembers. It was the silent witness to the entire affair, from the first nail hammered into a boat to the final desperate flight of its leader. And so, the story endures, passed down not in textbooks, but in the heart of the region itself. It has become a part of the Appalachian identity, a cautionary tale about a man of great ambition who tried to harness the restless spirit of the frontier for his own glory. The world might forget the details of the Burr conspiracy, but the mountains, the rivers, and the people who live in their shadow hold on to these memories. They remember the charismatic devil who came down the river, the paradise that was lost, and the grand dream of a Western empire that almost tore the nation apart before it was ever truly whole. And so, we come back to the question that started our journey into the shadows of the past. Was Aaron Burr a misunderstood patriot, or was he a would-be emperor? The truth, as is so often the case in these mountains, is far more complicated. Burr was a mirror. To men like Andrew Jackson, he reflected their own patriotic desire to fight the Spanish. To the dreamer Harmon Blennerhassett, he reflected a vision of an enlightened new society. And to the restless young men of the frontier, he reflected their own hunger for glory and wealth. The terrible genius of Aaron Burr was his ability to be all of these things at once, a man whose true plan was so cloaked in ambiguity that it allowed everyone to see in it the fulfillment of their own deepest desires. But this is a story not just of one man's ambition. It is a timeless lesson on the fragility of a nation. The Burr conspiracy laid bare the deep and dangerous cracks in the foundation of the young American Republic. It showed how easily the souls of a proud and forgotten people can be stirred by a charismatic leader who speaks to their grievances. The resentments of the Appalachian settlers were real, their feeling of abandonment was justified, and their discontent created a powder keg that Burr, for a moment, held the match to. This story serves as a stark and chilling warning that a union is not held together by laws and documents alone, but by a shared sense of purpose and trust. When that trust is broken, when a part of the nation feels its voice is not heard, the door is opened for men like Aaron Burr. It is a tale of how personal vendetta can masquerade as political destiny, and how the dream of a more perfect union can so nearly be shattered by the dream of a private empire. And now, my friends, you know the story of the phantom empire that rose and fell on these western waters, or at least as much of it as the river is willing to give up. I'm standing on a piece of ground that has a story to tell, though you wouldn't know it to look at it now. All that's left is a ghost of a chimney, clawing its way out of a tangle of kudzu and briars, and a few foundation stones sweating in the humidity. This was once the heart of the Lincoln family homestead, here in the deep hollows of Lincoln County, West Virginia. The air feels heavy, weighted down by memory. If you listen close, past the wind in the pines, you can almost hear the echoes of a conflict so brutal it was called a war that poisoned this ground and set neighbor against neighbor, kin against kin. Today, we're going to find out why. We're going to listen to these ruins and understand what happened right here that turned a family's dream into this pile of forgotten stone. Let's wind the clock back 150 years. The year is 1870. The chimney we see today isn't a ruin, it's the heart of a home, breathing a steady plume of wood smoke into the crisp morning air. The house it's attached to is a testament to hard work. 2 stories of hand-hewn poplar logs chinked tight against the mountain cold. The porch is wide, and on it sits the patriarch, Colonel Absalom Lincoln, a man as hard and unyielding as the rock-laced soil he commands. His face is a roadmap of hard-won battles, framed by a graying beard, but it's his left sleeve, neatly pinned to his shoulder, that tells the most important story. It's a constant, silent reminder of what he lost at Gettysburg, and a symbol of the cause he still believes in. From this porch, Absalom doesn't see a wilderness. He sees his kingdom. He sees the bottomland, dark and rich, where his sons are already working the fields with a pair of mules. He hears the rhythmic turn of the water wheel at his grist mill down on the creek, the only one for 10 miles in any direction. His world is one of order, built on the unshakable pillars of family, honor, and the sweat of your brow. The Lincolns are not just a family, they are a clan, the closest thing this part of West Virginia has to aristocracy, and Absalom is their unquestioned leader. They believe the old ways are the best ways, and that a man's worth is measured by the land he holds and the word he keeps. Life here is hard, but it's whole. In the house, the women are already at their chores, the smell of baking bread and boiling coffee mingling with the wood smoke. Children's laughter spills out from the yard. This isn't just a farm. It's the center of a community, a place where people come for justice, for advice, or to have their corn ground. For Absalom Lincoln, this homestead is more than property. It is the physical manifestation of his soul, a legacy he intends to pass down through generations. It is a symbol of survival, a piece of the old South rebuilt here in the mountains. But a shadow is beginning to creep up the hollows. Strangers have been seen in the hills, men with tripods and measuring chains, men in city clothes who speak with northern accents. They talk of progress, of timber rights and railroad lines. They speak of the black rock that lies in seams beneath the earth and the fortunes that can be made from it. To some, this is the sound of opportunity. To Colonel Lincoln, it sounds like a second invasion, a new kind of threat to the way of life he sacrificed his arm to defend. And he knows who is welcoming these invaders. The McCoy clan, led by Black Elias McCoy. They are new money, men who didn't fight for a cause but profited from the chaos, selling to both sides and getting rich while their neighbors bled. The Lincolns see them as scavengers, men without honor, who would sell the very ground from under their feet for a stack of Yankee dollars. For now, the conflict is a cold silence in the town square, a stiff nod at the crossroads. But on his porch, Absalom Lincoln watches the sun rise over his land, and he knows a storm is coming. He can feel it in the ache of his missing arm. To understand how a family's pride curdles into a generation of hate, you have to look beyond the soil and stone. You have to follow the paper trail, as thin and fragile as it may be. I've spent weeks doing just that, digging through dusty boxes in the archives, and I found something. This is what I believe is the first drop of poison. It's a page from the Lincoln County Ledger, dated November 6, 1872. The paper is brittle, the color of old tobacco, and it smells of time itself. Most of it is what you'd expect: crop prices, an ad for a liver tonic, a notice about a church social. But tucked away in a small column on the back page is a single dry paragraph that announces the results of the county election. It officially declares that Jedediah McCoy, brother of Black Elias, had been elected sheriff of Lincoln County. On the surface, this is just democracy at work. But you have to understand, in a place like this, the sheriff's badge was the keys to the kingdom. He controlled everything: who got arrested, whose land got seized for back taxes, and whose brand of justice was enforced. For as long as anyone could remember, the man wearing that badge had been a Lincoln, or a man loyal to the Lincolns. This small, forgotten news clipping wasn't just reporting a political upset, it was documenting a coup. This was the moment the McCoys seized the levers of power, and for Colonel Absalom Lincoln, it was an intolerable insult. This piece of paper tells us what happened, but the question that haunts this story, the question that led to all the bloodshed, is how. That small newspaper column was the official record, the final word. But the story of how Jedediah McCoy's name got printed there was written not in ink, but in sweat, whiskey, and the cold glint of northern silver dollars. On Election Day in 1872, the air outside the Hamlin courthouse was thick with a tension you could taste. It wasn't the celebratory mood of a civic duty. It was the quiet, watchful stillness of two armies waiting for the other to blink. The Lincolns and their supporters gathered on one side of the dusty square, the McCoys on the other. It was a division as clear as a property line drawn in blood. Colonel Absalom Lincoln stood on the courthouse steps, his one good hand resting on a hickory cane. He expected his cousin to win. It was a matter of tradition, of respect. The Lincolns had always guided the county, and their people, the families who had been here for generations, understood that. He watched the proceedings with a stern but confident eye, acknowledging the deferential nods of his fellow farmers and veterans. To him, this election was merely a reaffirmation of the natural order of things, a way of telling the world that the values of the Old South were still alive in these hills. But then came the strangers. They arrived in wagons, a rough-looking collection of men Absalom had never seen before. They weren't farmers. Their hands weren't calloused from the plow, but from the pickaxe and the sledgehammer. They were the survey crews and clearing gangs hired by the railroad interests that Black Elias McCoy had been courting. They were paid in cash and loyalty to the man who signed their checks. One by one, they cast their ballots, their unfamiliar faces a stark insult to the local men who had bled for this ground. A low murmur rippled through the Lincoln crowd. This wasn't an election, it was an invasion by proxy. When the final tally was read aloud, a moment of stunned silence fell over the square. It was quickly shattered by a triumphant roar from the McCoy side of the crowd. Jedediah McCoy had won by a handful of votes, just about the same number of strangers who had been brought in. Black Elias McCoy stood in the center of the celebration, a thin, knowing smile on his face. He had not won an election, he had purchased an office. Colonel Lincoln descended the steps, his face a mask of cold fury. He walked directly to Elias, the crowd parting before him. Their confrontation was quiet, but more menacing than any shout. "You bought this election," Absalom said, his voice low but carrying like a rifle shot in the winter air. "You bought it with northern money and railroad trash." Elias McCoy didn't flinch. He looked the one-armed colonel square in the eye. "The world is changing, Absalom," he replied, his own voice smooth as oiled steel. "It's a new time. You can either get on the train or get run over by it." In that moment, the lines were drawn. It was no longer about politics. It was about honor, about survival. And both men knew, standing there in the dust, that this conflict would not be settled at the ballot box again. Paper and ink can give you the facts, but they can't give you the feeling. They don't have a soul. To find that, you have to talk to the people who carry the story in their blood. That's what led me here, to a small, neat house perched on a hillside, to sit on a front porch with a woman named Sarah Lincoln Vance. She's 87 years old, the great-granddaughter of Colonel Absalom Lincoln's eldest son. Her hands are gnarled with age, but her eyes are sharp, and her memory is a library of stories that have never been written down. I showed her the newspaper clipping about the election. She looked at it, gave a slow, knowing nod, and handed it back to me. "That was the start of the trouble, all right," she said, her voice a soft mountain drawl. "But it ain't the start of the hate. Politics is one thing. That's about power. The hate started later. It started over a boy defending his father's honor. According to the story Sarah's grandmother told her, a few months after the election, there was a church social. It was one of those rare times when the whole county came together, a fragile truce under the eyes of God. But the McCoy victory had made their young men bold, arrogant. One of Elias McCoy's nephews, a boy barely 20, had too much corn liquor and decided to make a show of his family's new standing. He saw Colonel Lincoln standing by himself and said, loud enough for a dozen people to hear, "Looks like the colonel left his voting arm at Gettysburg along with his sense." The insult hung in the air, a stunning act of disrespect. The colonel, a man of immense pride and control, simply turned his back and walked away. But his youngest son, Daniel, who was only 16, saw it all. His face went white with rage. Sarah told me that her grandmother said Daniel was the apple of the colonel's eye, a boy with his father's fire and his mother's kindness. To see his father, a war hero, humiliated like that by a McCoy pup, it was more than he could bear. That, Sarah explained, is the real story behind the first death. The official record, the one whispered in the courthouse, was that Daniel Lincoln got into a dispute with that same McCoy boy over a property line a few days later. But the Lincoln family has always known the truth. Daniel didn't go to that hollow to argue over a few feet of dirt. He went there to demand an apology for his father. The property line was just the place where a boy's pride finally caught up with him. The election gave the McCoys the power, but it was that cruel joke that provided the spark. And that spark was about to ignite the whole damn county. The insult at the church social was a hot coal in Daniel Lincoln's gut. For days, it smoldered. He was only 16, but he had his father's unbending pride. He saw the way the other men looked at the colonel now with a hint of pity. He heard the whispers, and he saw the shame in his father's eyes, a look that cut the boy deeper than any knife. While the older men of the family spoke in hushed tones of political strategy and legal challenges, Daniel was consumed by a simpler, more primal code. An insult to his father's honor was an insult to the entire Lincoln name, and it had to be answered. He wasn't thinking of war or consequences. He was thinking like a son. He found Caleb McCoy, the boy who'd made the joke, working a stand of timber in a narrow hollow where their property lines blurred. It was a lonely place, the sound of the axe echoing off the steep hillsides, the air thick with the smell of pine sap. Daniel didn't come with a rifle leveled. He came on foot, his hands empty, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I want you to apologize to my father," Daniel said, his voice shaking but firm. Caleb McCoy, flush with the arrogance of his family's recent victory, just laughed. He leaned on his axe handle, a smirk on his face. "Your daddy's a cripple and his time is past," Caleb sneered. "Just like the rest of you Lincolns. Now get off my land before I run you off." He spat a wad of tobacco juice near Daniel's feet. That was the final spark. Daniel lunged, his fists clumsy but flying with all the pent-up rage of a wronged son. Caleb, bigger and a few years older, was taken by surprise but quickly recovered. The two boys tumbled to the ground, trading blows in the dirt and mud, a desperate, graceless fight fueled by generations of growing animosity. It wasn't a duel, it was a brawl. They rolled over roots and rocks, their grunts and curses swallowed by the vast indifference of the woods. The struggle carried them to the edge of a steep, rocky ravine that cut through the hollow. Caleb had Daniel pinned, his knuckles bloodying the boy's face. Daniel, in a surge of desperate strength, bucked and twisted, trying to throw him off. For a split second, their weight shifted. Caleb's boot slipped on a patch of wet moss. His eyes widened, his smirk replaced by a flash of genuine terror. He scrabbled for a handhold, but there was nothing but air. With a cry that was cut short by the sickening crack of a branch, he disappeared over the edge. Silence. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the gurgle of the creek below and Daniel's own ragged breaths. He crawled to the edge and looked down. Caleb McCoy lay twisted on the rocks below, his body unnaturally still. The fight was over. A 16-year-old boy, defending his father's honor, had just committed the first act of war. He scrambled back from the edge, a wave of cold horror washing over him, and he ran. He ran not as a victor, but as a terrified child who had just opened the gates of hell. When Caleb's body was found, the McCoys screamed for blood. Sheriff Jedediah McCoy declared it murder and swore to hang the Lincoln boy responsible. But Colonel Absalom Lincoln, seeing the terror in his own son's eyes, made a decision. He would not give his child to a McCoy sheriff and a McCoy mob. He gathered his clan, and at the funeral for the young Lincoln boy, because that is what the official story now became, a tragic hunting fall, he stood over the simple pine coffin and made his vow. "The law of this county is a tool for our enemies," he declared, his voice like iron. "From this day forward, we will be our own law, an eye for an eye, a life for a life." The point of no return had been crossed. The time for words was over. After a death like that, vengeance doesn't wait long in these mountains. It just waits for the right time and the right place. That place is here. I'm standing beside the Guyandotte River at a sharp, angry turn in the road that locals have called Devil's Elbow for as long as anyone can remember. Today, it's peaceful. The water rushes over the rocks and the sun filters down through a thick canopy of leaves. It's a beautiful, forgotten corner of the county. But if you know where to look, the scars are still here. This wide gravel shoulder I'm standing on isn't the original road. The old wagon trace ran closer to the water, right along the base of this sheer rock wall. And up there, about 50 feet above me, is a high wooded ridge that looks down on this entire bend. It's a perfect natural ambush point, a kill box designed by God himself. The sandstone up there is still pockmarked, weathered by a century of rain and ice, but you can still make them out. Dark little circles against the grey rock, each one a silent testament to the chaos that was unleashed right where I'm standing. This is where the Lincolns delivered their answer to the death of young Daniel. It wasn't a back-alley knife fight. It was a calculated military-style operation, planned and led by a man who had learned the art of war on the bloodiest battlefields in the nation. You have to imagine it. A slow-moving wagon, heavy with the payroll for a McCoy timber crew, rumbling down that narrow trace. The men inside, feeling safe, probably not even thinking of trouble. They never saw the shadows moving in the laurel up on that ridge. They only heard the sound of Colonel Lincoln's justice speaking all at once. The McCoy payroll wagon creaked its way along the river trace, moving at the slow, steady pace of the mules that pulled it. Inside, 3 McCoy kinsmen were relaxed, their rifles leaning against the wagon bed. The money, a heavy lockbox full of silver dollars, was a comforting weight between them. It was a warm afternoon in 1875. The air was sweet, and the only sounds were the jingle of the harness, the rumble of the wheels, and the endless rush of the Guyandotte. As they rounded Devil's Elbow, the high rock wall threw the road into deep shadow, offering a brief respite from the sun. It was the last moment of peace any of them would ever know. The first shot was not a warning. It was a declaration. A single sharp crack echoed from the ridge above, and the lead mule went down as if struck by lightning, its collapse throwing the entire wagon into a groaning, tangled halt. Before the McCoy men could even register what had happened, the ridge exploded in a volley of synchronized fire. It was not the scattered shooting of a brawl, it was the disciplined, concentrated fire of soldiers. The sound was a physical blow, a deafening wall of noise that hammered the wagon from above. The wooden sideboards of the wagon splintered instantly, peppered with a dozen heavy-caliber impacts. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and hot lead. The man holding the reins was thrown backward from his seat, the leather straps falling from his hands. A second man, who had been scrambling for his rifle, suddenly slumped forward over the lockbox, his own weapon clattering, unfired, to the floorboards. The third and final man managed to raise his pistol and fire a single wild shot toward the trees before he too was silenced, collapsing in a heap beside his comrades. Then, as suddenly as it began, an absolute silence fell over the bend in the road. It was a heavy, profound quiet, broken only by the panicked breathing of the remaining mule and the ceaseless murmur of the river. From the dense laurel on the ridge, a line of figures emerged, moving with quiet purpose down the steep incline. They were led by Colonel Absalom Lincoln. His face was grim, his eyes cold and methodical. He was not a man consumed by rage. He was a commander inspecting a battlefield after a successful engagement. He walked to the wagon and looked upon the scene of instant, overwhelming destruction. His men watched him, waiting for a command. Absalom surveyed the interior of the wagon, his gaze falling upon the untouched lockbox full of silver. He made no move toward it. This was not about money. This was about payment of a different kind. Reaching into his own pocket, he pulled out a single spent rifle cartridge, a 56 Spencer, the signature of his old cavalry unit, and placed it deliberately on the driver's seat. It was a message, a signature left in brass and smoke. He turned without another word and led his men back into the woods, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a monument of splintered wood and terrible silence. The war had begun in earnest. After the smoke clears and the bodies are carried away, the machinery of the law, however rusty and biased, has to turn. And this is what it produces. This is the official coroner's inquest, filed in the Lincoln County Courthouse just 2 days after the ambush at Devil's Elbow. The handwriting is a spidery, formal script on paper that has gone thin and brown with age, but the words themselves are cold, hard, and clipped. They are the official story, the version of events that was meant to be preserved for history. I'll read you the key passage. It says, "The deceased, identified as Silas McCoy, John R. McCoy, and Peter Vance, did come to their deaths by means of multiple gunshot wounds. Evidence suggests the attack was carried out from the high ridge overlooking the road. The company payroll box, containing approximately $200, was found undisturbed. The perpetrators are, at this time, unknown. Perpetrators unknown. In a county this small, where every family knows every other family's business, that phrase is a lie. A necessary, legal lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. The whole county knew who had the skill to organize an attack like that. The whole county knew who owned Spencer repeating rifles, and the whole county knew who had a fresh grudge and a score to settle. This document, in its sterile official language, scrubs the passion from the event. It doesn't mention the insult at the church social or the death of a 16-year-old boy. It reduces Colonel Lincoln's methodical act of vengeance to a simple, anonymous triple homicide. But this dry, passionless report was more than just a historical record. For Sheriff Jedediah McCoy, it was a weapon. It was the legal justification he'd been waiting for. It transformed a family feud into a matter of state law. Armed with this piece of paper, he could deputize his kinsmen, raise a posse, and legally ride out to the Lincoln homestead, not as an avenging McCoy, but as the High Sheriff of Lincoln County, serving a warrant and hunting down fugitives. The law had officially chosen a side. Sheriff Jedediah McCoy didn't waste a moment. That coroner's report was the only authority he needed, a piece of tin and paper that gave his vengeance the color of law. He deputized a dozen men that very day. This was no impartial posse of civic-minded citizens. It was a swarm of angry hornets. Every man was a McCoy by blood or by payroll, their faces hard, their eyes alight with a hunger for retribution. They rode out from Hamlin not as peacekeepers, but as an army, with Sheriff McCoy at their head, the warrants for Absalom Lincoln's sons tucked safely in his coat pocket. Their destination was the Lincoln homestead. They thundered up the hollow, a column of armed horsemen that was a clear and brutal message. This was not an attempt at a quiet arrest. It was a show of force meant to intimidate and to break the will of the Lincoln clan. But when they arrived, they found not a terrified family, but a fortress. The heavy shutters were barred on the windows, the porch was empty, and the long barrels of several rifles poked from carefully cut loopholes in the log walls. Colonel Absalom Lincoln himself stepped out onto the porch, his Spencer rifle held ready in his one good hand. Sheriff McCoy held up the warrants. "Absalom, I'm here for your boys by the authority of Lincoln County." The colonel's reply was as cold and sharp as a winter wind. "Your authority ends where my property begins, Jedediah. Your piece of paper means nothing here." Now turn your riders around before I am forced to defend my home." For a long, tense moment, the two sides faced each other in absolute silence. Then, a nervous McCoy deputy shifted his weight, his horse stamped, and a rifleman inside the Lincoln house took it as a threat. A single shot cracked the stillness, kicking up dirt just in front of McCoy's horse. That was all it took. The posse unleashed a ragged volley of fire at the house, which was answered by the disciplined, withering fire of the defenders. McCoy's men were exposed, out in the open, and after several minutes of taking the worst of the exchange, they were forced into a humiliating retreat back down the hollow. Furious and thwarted, Jedediah and Elias McCoy devised a new strategy. If they couldn't take the Lincoln fort, they would seize the counties. They rode their posse back into Hamlin, but they didn't disperse. Instead, they dismounted and, in a shocking act of insurrection, stormed the county courthouse. They threw out the Lincoln-appointed clerk and barricaded the doors. From the windows of the very building meant to dispense justice, McCoy riflemen now aimed their weapons out at the town square. There was no trial. There was no capture. The verdict was delivered by Jedediah McCoy himself, who hung a hand-painted sign from the courthouse balcony. By order of the sheriff, martial law is in effect. All sympathizers of the Lincoln clan will be deemed outlaws. The pursuit of the law had ended with the law itself being taken hostage. Lincoln County now had two armed camps, two governments. The Lincolns, barricaded in their home, and the McCoys, ruling from a stolen courthouse. The town of Hamlin became a no-man's land where the slightest movement could draw a sniper's bullet, and the promise of a full-scale battle hung over the valley like a storm cloud waiting to break. Every war, no matter how large or small, ends in the same place, a quiet plot of ground under a silent sky. I'm here now, in the old Hamlin Cemetery, a place where the stones lean like tired old men, and the stories they tell are slowly being erased by wind and rain. The grass is high, and the only sound is the drone of cicadas in the ancient oaks. I came here to find the final chapters of the two men who started it all, to see where their ambition and their bitterness finally led them. It wasn't hard to find Colonel Absalom Lincoln. His grave is on a small rise overlooking the valley. It's a simple, dignified stone of grey granite, the kind a soldier would choose. The inscription is clear and deep: Colonel Absalom Lincoln, CSA, beloved father and husband. A small, sun-bleached Confederate flag is planted in the earth beside it, a sign that even after all these years, someone still comes here to remember the man and the cause he fought for. His legacy, at least to his own family, is one of honor. Finding Black Elias McCoy was a different story. His grave is tucked away in a low-lying corner of the cemetery, where the water gathers and the weeds grow thickest. His headstone was clearly once more expensive than the colonel's, a tall, ornate piece of marble, but time has been cruel to it. It's tilted badly, stained dark green with moss, and a thick vein of ivy is slowly choking the inscription. I had to pull it away to even read the name. Here lies the man who wanted to drag the county into the modern age, the man who dealt in railroads and northern money, yet his final resting place is forgotten, sinking back into the earth. And here is the final bitter irony of the Lincoln County War. They lie just 100 yards apart now. The proud colonel and the ambitious McCoy, enemies who set the hills on fire with their hatred, are now silent neighbors for eternity. They fought for control of a whole county, for timber rights and political power, and in the end, this is all they hold: a 6-foot plot of dirt. Their war of sieges and snipers didn't last forever. It had to end. And standing here between their graves, the question becomes unavoidable. What was the final act that brought these two powerful men to this quiet, humble end? The journey from the courthouse siege to those two lonely graves was not a short one. It was a slow, grinding descent into a hell of their own making. The standoff was eventually broken by a traveling circuit judge, a brave man named Theron Parsons, who rode into Hamlin flanked by federal marshals. He brokered a fragile truce, a peace as thin as January ice, forcing the McCoys to relinquish the courthouse and the Lincolns to lay down their arms under the threat of state intervention. For a few tense months, an uneasy quiet settled over the county, but the hate was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. That fragile peace was shattered by a single rifle shot in the summer of 1878. Judge Parsons, seen as sympathetic to the Lincolns, was sitting on the porch of his boarding house when a bullet from the shadows found him. The assassination was a message. There was no room for impartial law in Lincoln County. The truce was over. The act was so brazen, so final, that it pushed both sides past the point of no return. The rules of engagement, if there ever were any, were burned along with the judge's body on the funeral pyre. The conflict then devolved into a new, more ruinous kind of warfare: economic destruction. One moonless night, McCoy riders swept through the Lincoln holdings, their torches finding the grist mill and the barns full of the year's harvest. The orange glow against the night sky was visible for miles, a signal that the McCoys were no longer just trying to win, but to erase the Lincolns from the land entirely. The retaliation was swift and terrible. The Lincolns, led by Absalom's remaining sons, no longer targeted barns. They targeted homes, setting fire to the McCoy homesteads and driving women and children out into the cold. It was a war of total annihilation, where the goal was to leave the enemy with nothing but ashes. This was the war that finally broke both clans. Black Elias McCoy, for all his cunning, found his fortune turning to ash in his hands. He had spent everything on hired guns, legal fees and bribes, and with his timber operations constantly under threat, his northern business partners abandoned him. He died a few years later, not from a bullet, but a broken man, his dreams of a McCoy dynasty ruined, leaving little behind but debts and a legacy of hate. Colonel Absalom Lincoln met a more direct, but no less tragic, end. In the spring of 1880, believing the worst of the fighting was over, he was out plowing his field, trying to bring life back to the soil that had soaked up so much blood. The man who had survived Gettysburg, who had fortified his home against a sheriff's army, was shot in the back by an unknown assassin from the tree line. He died with his hand on the plow. With the patriarchs of both families gone, the war simply ran out of fuel. The long shadow it cast, however, would stretch for generations, a darkness that fell not just on the families who fought, but on the very soul of the county itself. You might think that after 150 years, the dust would have settled, and the story of the Lincoln County War would be just that, a story. But you'd be wrong. The shooting may have stopped in 1880, but the war of words, the war of whispers and memory, never truly ended. It's still being fought today in quiet conversations on front porches and at family reunions. The truth of what happened depends entirely on who you ask, because in Lincoln County, history isn't a single solid thing. It's a fractured mirror, and every family holds a piece. To this day, if you find someone with the last name Lincoln, they will tell you a story of heroes and villains. In their version, Colonel Absalom Lincoln was a tragic patriarch, a man of unshakable honor who was forced to defend his family and his way of life against a tide of corruption. The McCoys were nothing but greedy upstarts, puppets for northern industrialists who stole an election and used a tainted badge to wage a campaign of terror. The ambush at Devil's Elbow wasn't murder, it was justice. Fortifying their home wasn't insurrection, it was a desperate act of self-preservation. Absalom Lincoln, they'll tell you, died a martyr for the old ways. But go down the road a few miles to a hollow where the McCoy name is still common, and you will hear a very different tale. They'll tell you Black Elias McCoy was a visionary, a man of progress who saw a future for Lincoln County beyond subsistence farming and isolation. He was trying to bring jobs, money, and the railroad into these hills, but he was blocked at every turn by the Lincolns, a violent, stubborn clan who couldn't accept that the world had changed. In their story, the Lincolns were the aggressors, murderers who killed a boy over a petty squabble and ambushed honest men on a public road. Jedediah McCoy wasn't a crooked sheriff. He was a brave lawman trying to bring killers to justice in the face of an armed rebellion. So who was the hero and who was the villain? The truth, as it so often does in these mountains, probably lives somewhere in the grey shadows between those two stories. Most of the other old families in the county, the ones who weren't Lincolns or McCoys, have their own version. They'll tell you it was a pointless feud between two proud, power-hungry clans that tore the county apart, bled it dry, and left it weak and vulnerable. They see both Absalom and Elias not as heroes or villains, but as two stubborn old fools who, in their fight over who would rule the county, ended up destroying it for everyone, paving the way for the real conquerors, the coal and timber companies who bought up the land for pennies on the dollar from the widows and orphans left behind. When a story is carved into a place with this much blood and sorrow, the facts themselves often become too heavy to carry. Over the generations, the sharp, painful edges of history get worn smooth and the story transforms. It stops being a dry account of an election and an ambush, and it becomes something else entirely, a legend. The Lincoln County War didn't just leave scars on the landscape. It left ghosts in the minds of the people, specters that still walk the high ridges and whisper in the deep hollows. The most enduring of these is the tale of the phantom rider of Hart's Creek. Even now, some old-timers will tell you that if you're out on the ridges at dusk, you might see him, a lone figure on a pale horse silhouetted against the dying light. He never gets close, never makes a sound. He just watches. During the war, men from both sides claimed to have seen him right before a killing, a silent omen of the violence to come. Some say he's the ghost of a soldier, eternally watching his home tear itself apart. Others believe he is death himself, drawn to these hills by the sheer volume of hate. The historical fact of the ambushes and killings has been given a supernatural guardian, a way for the people to personify the sense of doom that hung over the county. This is how the community processed the trauma. The raw greed of Black Elias McCoy was too mundane, so it was transformed into a legend of a devil's bargain, a story that he sold the souls of his kinsmen to a dark-suited stranger in exchange for power. The cold-blooded tactics of Colonel Lincoln were easier to understand if you believed he was acting under a curse laid on the land by a crooked surveyor. The facts of the war became the bones, but folklore, ghost stories, and cautionary tales grew over them like flesh. It's the final stage in a story's life, the moment history dissolves and a legend is born to carry the emotional truth of what was lost. And so we find ourselves back where we started, here at the lonely chimney, standing sentinel over the ghost of the Lincoln homestead. When we first stood here, this was just a pile of stones, a forgotten ruin in a tangle of weeds. But it's not just a ruin anymore, is it? Now we see it for what it is. It's a monument. It's a testament to the pride of a one-armed colonel, to the fury of a son defending his father's honor, and to the terrible final silence that fell when the war was over. These stones are heavy with the weight of that story, a story of how a home can become a fortress, and how a fortress can become a tomb. We have walked a long and bloody road today, from a dusty newspaper archive to a quiet front porch where memories are still kept alive. We stood at Devil's Elbow, where justice was delivered from the barrel of a rifle, and we walked between the graves of two old enemies who are now neighbors in the silent earth. We have seen how a political squabble, fueled by a simple, cruel insult, could ignite a fire that would consume two families and poison a county for 100 years. The ultimate tragedy of the Lincoln County War is that in the end, nobody won. The Lincolns and the McCoys fought over who would control the future of these hills, and they fought with such ferocity that they destroyed each other. Their war left a vacuum, a void of power and leadership that was quickly filled by the very outsiders they both, in their own ways, distrusted. The coal and timber barons swept in, and the true conquest of Lincoln County began, not with a gunshot, but with the stroke of a pen on a deed. So the next time you pass a forgotten ruin on a lonely road, remember that it's not just a pile of stones. It's a library, filled with stories of love, loss, and the choices that define us. The people are gone, the houses are gone, but the story remains. Here, on the banks of the Nolichucky River, the water still speaks in the old tongue of the mountains. It tumbles over rocks that have seen empires rise and fall, and it whispers through trees that remember a time when this was the very edge of the world. It was here, in this misty East Tennessee Valley, that a man came and took the river's name for his own, branding himself into the landscape forever. They called him Nolichucky Jack. But was he a hero, a rebel, or a king in buckskin? Today, we're going to follow the current back in time, because these waters hold a story of fire, blood, and ambition that shaped the very soul of Appalachia. Let's go back to 1773. Imagine this valley not as a quiet, settled place, but as the raw, bleeding edge of a new continent. This was a world of towering hardwoods and shadow-filled hollows, where the law was whatever a man could enforce with a long rifle and a steady hand. The settlements here, places like Watauga and Holston, weren't towns. They were clusters of raw log cabins huddled together for warmth and safety, islands in a vast, untamed wilderness. This was land that was promised by God, but forbidden by a king across the ocean, and more importantly, it was the ancestral hunting ground of the Cherokee. Into this crucible walked John Sevier. He wasn't born of these mountains. He was a man from Virginia with a hunger for land that was sharper than any axe. When he arrived and built his home on the Nolichucky, he didn't look like a mountain-born brawler. He was handsome, charming, with a gaze that could disarm a rival or win the loyalty of a stranger in a single glance. He had the easy smile of a man who knew deep in his bones that you'd follow him, that you'd trust him with your life. But those who looked closer saw something else. Beneath the charisma was a core of cold, hard steel. This wasn't just a farmer looking for a homestead. This was a born leader, a speculator, a man who saw this forbidden land not just as a home, but as an empire in the making. He was building a life here with his wife and children, but every nail he hammered was an act of defiance against a distant government and a declaration of war against the people who had called this place home for centuries. The air itself was thick with tension. To the west, Cherokee leaders like Dragging Canoe watched the endless stream of settlers and swore a blood oath to drive them back across the mountains. To the east, the whispers of rebellion against the British Crown were growing into a roar. Sevier and his neighbors were caught in the middle, squatters on stolen land, poised on the brink of a war that would force them to choose a side. They had come seeking freedom, but they had found themselves in a powder keg, and John Sevier was the man holding the match. To really understand what forged John Sevier from a simple settler into a legend, you can't just look at maps or read treaties. You have to feel the weight of the times. I'm holding a piece of that weight right here in my hands. It's a trade tomahawk, the kind that were mass-produced in English foundries. The iron head is simple, brutal, and efficient. The hickory handle is smooth from a century of handling. It feels cold, balanced, and deadly. But this isn't just an antique weapon. This is a political document written in steel. When the revolution began, the British had a strategy for their southern frontier: turn the mountains red. They funneled weapons like this one to the Cherokee and other tribes, encouraging them to attack the rebellious settlements. For the British, it was a calculated move in a global war. But for the families living in those isolated cabins, it meant this object became a symbol of their worst nightmares. It was the face of a war that didn't happen on distant battlefields, but on their own doorsteps. This simple tool forces us to ask a visceral question, one that cuts through the pages of history. What happens when the world outside your thin wooden walls is consumed by fire and screams? What does a man like John Sevier do when he's looking over the palisade of a besieged fort and sees a young woman running for her life, with a weapon just like this one slicing through the air right behind her? When the revolution finally broke, it wasn't a glorious affair of flags and cannons on the frontier. It was a wave of pure terror. The British strategy was simple and brutal. They would unleash their allies, the Cherokee, upon the settlements. The war had come to the mountains, and it came on silent, moccasined feet, armed with English steel. Suddenly, every rustle in the woods, every shadow at dusk, could mean death. Cabins were burned, families scattered, and the survivors fled to the flimsy security of their forts. At Fort Watauga, the air was thick with the stench of fear and gunpowder. Hundreds of Cherokee warriors, led by the brilliant and implacable Dragging Canoe, materialized from the forest and laid siege to the crude wooden walls. Inside, John Sevier was no longer just a landowner. He was a commander, responsible for the lives of every man, woman, and child huddled within. The siege was a grinding nightmare of sniper fire, of terrifying war cries that echoed through the night, a constant reminder that death was only a few feet of log wall away. It was during this chaos that the legend of Nolichucky Jack was truly born. A young woman, Catherine Sherrill, was caught outside the walls when the attack began. As she sprinted across the cleared ground toward the fort, she was a lone figure of desperation. She could hear the footsteps pounding behind her, could feel the nearness of her pursuers. A tomahawk, a weapon just like this one, its polished edge glinting in the sun, whizzed past her ear and thudded into the gate just as she reached it. It was barred shut. For a heart-stopping second, her hope died. But from the top of the wall, John Sevier had seen it all. As Catherine, in a final act of pure will, leapt for the top of the palisade, his hands shot out, grabbing her arms and hauling her over the edge to safety. In that single breathtaking moment, Sevier became more than a man. He became a protector, a hero. The seeds of conflict, sown by a distant king, had just bloomed into a very personal war for him, and that heroic rescue planted the seeds of a love story that would itself become a cornerstone of Appalachian folklore. History books can give you the dates and the names, but they can't give you the soul of a story. For that, you have to talk to the people who are its living keepers. My search for the soul of the King's Mountain story led me to the back room of a county historical society, a place that smelled of old paper and cedar. It's there I met a local historian, a man in his 80s whose family had been in these hills since before Tennessee was even a dream. His name isn't important. What is important is that the stories of this place run in his blood. I asked him about Major Ferguson's threat. Why did it light such a fire? Why march over a frozen mountain on what looked like a suicide mission? He leaned back in his creaky wooden chair and gave me a look that said I was asking the wrong question entirely. "You have to understand," he said, his voice a low Appalachian rumble. "Ferguson didn't threaten an army. There was no army. He threatened their hearthstones." He explained that these weren't soldiers who answered to a distant general. They were clans. They were families. Their loyalty was to the man whose land bordered their own, to the neighbor who helped them raise a barn. When Patrick Ferguson promised to hang their leaders and lay their country waste with fire and sword, it wasn't a threat of war. It was a promise of annihilation aimed directly at their wives, their children, and their homes. "My great-great-great-uncle was there," the old man continued, tapping a weathered finger on a map. "Family law says he was plowing a field when the rider came with the news. He didn't even unhitch the mule. He just dropped the reins, walked into his cabin, took his long rifle from over the fireplace, and told his wife he'd be back when it was done." That single image, passed down through generations, tells you more than any history book. This wasn't a political calculation. It was a personal insult, a blood feud declared on an entire people. And it was an insult that could only be answered one way. Major Patrick Ferguson's threat was a spark on dry tinder. It wasn't heard in a government hall. It was carried by riders from one isolated settlement to the next, a whispered promise of hellfire that spread through the mountains like a contagion of rage. This wasn't a challenge to an army. It was a personal insult, a vow to burn out the very heart of the Over-Mountain people. And in that moment, something shifted in the soul of the frontier. The time for talk was over. The time for defense was over. This was now a hunt. The gathering at Sycamore Shoals was not a military muster, it was a human flood. Men poured out of the hollows and down from the ridges, their faces set like stone. They were a rough-hewn army, clad in buckskin and homespun, their only uniform a shared fury. Their weapon was the American long rifle, a tool of subsistence that had become an instrument of vengeance. They left their plows in the field, their harvests in the barn, and their families with a grim promise to return. In the center of this storm of men stood John Sevier. Alongside Isaac Shelby, he was the axis around which this whole desperate enterprise turned. He didn't need to give speeches. His presence was enough. He moved through the camp, his piercing gaze meeting the eyes of farmers and hunters, transforming their individual anger into a singular, deadly purpose. He was one of them, but he was also more. He was the embodiment of their defiance. The decision was made. They would not wait for Ferguson to bring his fire and sword to them. They would take the war to him. They would do the unthinkable, march over the high, snow-dusted peaks of the Appalachians, leaving their own homes vulnerable to hunt down a superior British force. This was the point of no return. As they turned their faces east and began their climb into the freezing autumn air, they were no longer just settlers. They were an avalanche of buckskin and fury, and they would not stop until they had buried Ferguson and his army on a mountain of his own choosing. Today, Kings Mountain is a place of profound peace. You can walk the paved trails, hear the wind rustling the leaves, and read the solemn granite monuments that mark the place where a battle turned the tide of a war. But the true evidence, the real scar left on this landscape, isn't carved in stone. It's the land itself. You have to leave the path and feel the ground under your feet to understand what happened here. This isn't a mountain in the way you might imagine. It's a long, steep-sided ridge that rises abruptly from the surrounding country. When Major Ferguson brought his loyalist army up here, he thought he had found the perfect fortress. From this high ground, he could see in every direction, and he believed no army could assault such a steep, rugged slope. He was so confident, he reportedly boasted that he was king of this mountain, and that God Almighty and all the rebels out of hell could not drive him from it. He saw a fortress. He failed to understand that he was choosing a tomb, right here. Stand at the bottom of the slope and look up. You can feel the steepness in your legs and your lungs. This is where it happened. Ferguson's men were arrayed on the cleared summit, a perfect target against the skyline. But the Over-Mountain men didn't attack in formation. They used the dense woods on these slopes for cover, melting between the very trees that still stand here today. Each of these ancient oaks, each of these weathered rock outcroppings, became a silent testament to the chaos of that day. This whole ridge became a killing jar, and the Over-Mountain men were about to seal the lid. It began with a sound that was not quite human. From the base of the mountain on all sides, a terrifying chorus of whoops and yells erupted from the trees, the sound of panthers, of wolves, of men who had become something primal. The Over-Mountain men didn't march. They swarmed up the wooded slopes, a relentless tide of buckskin and iron will. It was a kind of warfare the British had never truly understood. For every volley of musketry the Loyalists fired down the hill, hitting little more than bark and shadow. A dozen puffs of white smoke would answer from the trees below. The crack of the long rifles was sharp, personal. Each one was a sentence of death delivered from an unseen judge. A man in a bright red coat would be reloading on the summit, and then he would simply fold, vanishing into the chaos. The Loyalists charged with bayonets, a wave of disciplined steel meant to break any line, but there was no line to break. The frontiersmen just melted back into the forest, letting the charge pass, only to rise up on their flanks and rear, their rifles speaking again and again. The fortress had become a slaughter pen, Above the din, Major Ferguson's silver whistle could be heard, a shrill, piercing note trying to impose order on pure chaos. He rode his white horse back and forth across the summit, a magnificent, defiant target rallying his crumbling lines. For an hour, the mountain was consumed by a storm of lead and fury. The air grew heavy and acrid with the smell of gunpowder. The roar of battle was continuous, a deafening drumbeat of rifle fire, screams and war cries. Then, suddenly, the silver whistle fell silent. The man on the white horse, who had seemed invincible just moments before, reeled in his saddle. He swayed for a moment, a stunned look on his face, before sliding to the ground. With his fall, the last bit of fight drained from the loyalist force. White handkerchiefs began to appear, tied to the ends of ramrods and held aloft in surrender. The shooting didn't stop immediately. The raw fury that had carried them over a frozen mountain demanded a final, terrible price. But soon, a new sound replaced the gunfire, the triumphant, breathless roar of men who knew they had just broken the back of the British war in the south. After the gun smoke clears, the ink begins to flow. This is a copy of the official report on the Battle of Kings Mountain, written by the commanders and sent to the Continental Congress. It's written in the formal, looping script of the 18th century, and its language is as detached as the battle itself was intimate and brutal. It talks of troop movements, of casualties, and of objectives secured. It describes the battle in a single, sanitized phrase: a sharp conflict. A sharp conflict. Those three words are the cold ashes left over from a raging fire. There is no mention in this dry report of the war cries that echoed through the trees, or the raw fury of men avenging a threat against their homes. The official record doesn't tell you about the terror in the eyes of the loyalists as they were swarmed from all sides, or the grim satisfaction of the frontiersmen as they won. The paperwork of war is always a ghost of the real thing, a sterile summary that strips away the blood and the humanity. And this is where the story of John Sevier takes its most important turn. In this document, he is a hero of the new United States, a loyal officer serving the cause of liberty. But what this paper trail doesn't show is what was happening in Sevier's own mind. He had just seen how power was won, not in distant congresses, but by the will of determined men with rifles in their hands. As he rode home over the mountains, a hero of continental fame, he wasn't just thinking about the war he had won, he was thinking about the kingdom he was about to build. The official record sealed his legend as a patriot, but it was a title he was already preparing to betray. The hero returned from Kings Mountain not just to a home, but to a vacuum of power. North Carolina, broke and exhausted from the war, ceded its western lands to the federal government, effectively abandoning the over-mountain settlements. Left without courts, laws, or protection, the people did what they had always done. They took matters into their own hands. In 1784, they declared themselves a new, independent state, the state of Franklin, and there was only one man they would trust to be its governor, John Sevier. For a brief, shining moment, Nolichucky Jack was a king in his own right, ruling over a renegade republic carved out of the wilderness. But the law, however distant, has a long memory. North Carolina quickly regretted its decision and reasserted its claim, creating chaos. Two governments now claimed the same land. The conflict became a bitter personal feud between Sevier and a man named John Tipton, a former brother-in-arms from Kings Mountain who now led the North Carolina Loyalist faction. This wasn't a political debate, it was a civil war in miniature, a clash of two frontier titans who refused to bend. The breaking point came in the dead of winter. Tipton's faction, acting for North Carolina, seized some of Sevier's enslaved people as payment for back taxes. For Sevier, this was the ultimate insult. Enraged, he raised a small army and laid siege to Tipton's farm. The Battle of Franklin was a tragic farce played out in a blizzard. For days, the two sides traded insults and gunfire from behind fences and trees until a surprise attack by Tipton's reinforcements shattered Sevier's force. The state of Franklin collapsed in the snow and mud, and its governor was now a wanted man. The law's pursuit began. The hero of Kings Mountain was now a fugitive, hiding in the very mountains that had once hailed him as their savior. He was hunted by the government of North Carolina, the state he had once defended so ferociously. The cheers of victory were replaced by the quiet footsteps of a man on the run, a king with no kingdom, charged with the high crime of treason. Eventually, the law caught up with him. He wasn't captured in a blaze of glory, but arrested quietly, a shocking humiliation for a man of his stature. They put him in irons. Imagine that sight. Nolichucky Jack, the Indian fighter, the revolutionary commander, being hauled back over the mountains, not as a hero, but as a common felon. The tense journey ended at the courthouse in Morganton, North Carolina, where he was to be tried for his life. But as he stood before the court, a different kind of justice arrived. A mob of his armed followers stormed the building, freed him from his captors, and set him back on his horse. The official verdict was never delivered, because the people of the frontier had already delivered their own. John Sevier simply rode away, a free man, proving that in Appalachia, the loyalty of the people could be a law unto itself. To find the final chapter of this story, you have to visit two very different pieces of ground. The first is here, on the lawn of the old Knox County Courthouse, in the heart of the city he helped build. A grand stone monument marks the final resting place of John Sevier. It proclaims him a hero, a patriot, the first governor of the state of Tennessee. He lies here in a place of ultimate public honor, celebrated as a founding father. But as you stand here, you can't help but feel the paradox. This is the grave of a man who was once arrested, put in irons, and charged with high treason. To understand the other side of that conflict, you have to travel a few miles away to a quieter place. Here, on the rolling farmland that was once his home, lies John Tipton. His grave is simple, solid, unyielding, much like the man himself who stood for the law when it was unpopular and faced down the most famous man on the frontier. He rests on the very land he defended, the homestead that Sevier himself once besieged. They lie just a county apart now, enemies in life, neighbors in death. The man who upheld the law rests on his private farm, while the rebel who defied him is enshrined in the town square. This stark contrast, written in granite and soil, is the final, silent testament to their long and bitter feud. It forces us to ask the most crucial question of all. What happened in the years after the guns fell silent? How did the fugitive Nolichucky Jack not only escape justice, but rise from the ashes of his failed state to become the most powerful man in Tennessee? The long shadow of his failed state hung over John Sevier, but he was a man who thrived in the half-light. After his dramatic rescue, he was still technically a fugitive, a traitor in the eyes of North Carolina. But in the mountains and hollows of his homeland, he was simply Nolichucky Jack, their leader, protected by a fierce loyalty that no law could penetrate. He was a political ghost they couldn't exorcise. So what does a man do when his kingdom has crumbled and his enemies hold all the legal cards? He finds a new game to play. And this is where Sevier's story takes a dark, secretive turn. A desperate man, he began a clandestine correspondence with Spanish diplomats. He hinted that the frustrated people of the frontier, feeling abandoned by the United States, might be willing to secede entirely and place themselves under the protection of the King of Spain in exchange for free navigation of the Mississippi River. Was it genuine treason? Or was it the shrewdest political bluff in American history? A move designed to force the young United States to finally pay attention to its western frontier. The truth is buried with him, but it shows a man willing to risk everything to protect his interests and regain his power. Meanwhile, North Carolina faced a dilemma. They couldn't arrest Sevier. His followers would simply free him again. They couldn't ignore him. His influence was too great. They couldn't defeat him, so they did the only thing they could. They embraced him. In a stunning act of political pragmatism, they issued a full pardon for his treason. Then they went a step further. They elected the rebel leader to their own state senate. It was a masterstroke. By bringing him into the system, they neutralized him as an outlaw. But they had underestimated Nolichucky Jack. He wasn't neutralized. He was legitimized. He took his seat in the government that had once hunted him and used his new position, combined with his undiminished popularity back home, to fight for the one thing he always wanted, a new state. But this time, done the right way. He outmaneuvered every opponent, trading his buckskin jacket for a politician's coat without ever losing the grit of the frontiersman. When Tennessee was finally granted statehood in 1796, there was no debate, no question about who would lead it. The election of John Sevier as its first governor wasn't a political victory. It was a coronation. The rebel king was dead. Long live the governor. And that's where the story gets complicated, because even today, John Sevier isn't one man, he's two. The first Sevier is the one written in stone and bronze, the man on the monument. This is Nolichucky Jack the hero, the father of Tennessee, the fearless Indian fighter who protected the fledgling settlements from annihilation. To this day, if you ask the descendants of the Over-Mountain men, they will tell you he was a patriot who risked everything at Kings Mountain and a statesman who carved a civilization from a savage wilderness. This is the Sevier of public record and popular legend. But then there's the other John Sevier. This is the man whose story isn't written on monuments, but whispered in the shadows of history. To understand this Sevier, you have to stand on the other side of the Nolichucky River, on the land that was once the sovereign territory of the Cherokee Nation. From that perspective, Sevier wasn't a hero. He was the leading edge of an invasion. He wasn't a protector. He was a conqueror. Every acre of land he settled was an acre of land he took. His 35 battles weren't heroic skirmishes. They were a relentless campaign of ethnic cleansing. And it wasn't just about land for a home. The second Sevier was a ruthless speculator, a man whose patriotism and personal profit were always tangled together. His renegade state of Franklin looks less like a noble experiment in democracy and more like a massive land grab, an attempt to secure his and his cronies' illegal claims. His flirtation with Spain wasn't a bluff. It was the act of a man whose ultimate loyalty was to his own ambition. So who was the real Nolichucky Jack? Was he the courageous patriot or the greedy opportunist? The community builder or the dispossessor of a people? The truth is, he was all of it. He was a man who contained the violent, contradictory, and deeply flawed soul of the American frontier itself. And to this day in Appalachia, the version of the story you hear still depends entirely on which side of the mountain your family came from. When a man's life is as large and loud as John Sevier's, it doesn't just end when he's laid in the ground. It seeps into the soil. It becomes part of the mist that hangs in the hollows. The hard facts of his life, the battles, the politics, the betrayals, began to soften over the decades, smoothed over by time like river stones, until a new shape emerged, the shape of a legend. The most powerful legends are often the ones people needed to be true. Take the story that he fought in over 30 battles and was never once wounded. Historically, it's an incredible feat of luck and skill. But in the telling and retelling around a hearthfire, it became something more. It became proof. In a world of constant, random violence, where a snakebite or a fever could kill as surely as a tomahawk, the belief that their leader was untouchable, that he was shielded by Providence itself, wasn't just a story. It was a shield for their own hearts. But every bright legend casts a long shadow. There's another kind of story you'll hear in East Tennessee, one told in a hushed voice after the children are in bed. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is hidden and the river fog is thick, you can still hear the echoes of his forgotten wars down by the Nolichucky. They say it isn't Sevier's ghost you have to worry about. It's the ghosts of those he fought, the Cherokee spirits still bound to the land he took, their whispers of anger and loss carried on the water. It became a cautionary tale, a way for the mountains themselves to remember the price that was paid for the state he built. And so, the man became a myth. He is both the invincible hero protected by heaven and the haunted figure whose deeds left unquiet spirits in his wake. The history books tell you what John Sevier did, but it's the folklore, the ghost stories, and the tall tales whispered from one generation to the next that tell you how the mountains remember him. So we find ourselves back where we started, here on the banks of the Nolichucky. The river still speaks its ancient language, tumbling over the same stones, but we hear it differently now. We can no longer see this as just a quiet valley. We see the ghosts. We see the raw frontier, the smoke of the cabin, and the determined figure of a man who took the river's name and made it his own, bending a wilderness to his will. The journey to understand John Sevier is to understand that our heroes are never simple. It's easy to want the man on the monument to be the whole story, a flawless patriot cast in bronze. But the Appalachian frontier was no place for simple men. It demanded men who were as complex and contradictory as the land itself, men who could be both courageous and cruel, builders and destroyers, heroes and villains, sometimes all in the space of a single day. Sevier wasn't a good man who did bad things, or a bad man who did good things. He was a man of his time, and his time was a storm. So the next time you pass a forgotten ruin on a lonely road, or see an old name carved into a county courthouse, remember that it's not just a pile of stones or a word on a map. It's a library filled with stories of love, loss, and the brutal choices that define us. The story of Nolichucky Jack is a reminder that our history is not a clean, straight line. It's a tangled, bloody, and glorious thicket, and it's in those shadows and contradictions that the truest stories are found. The people are gone. The houses are gone. The world they fought for has vanished. But the story remains. For 3 days, the law in Blackwater County was gone. A posse of the county's toughest men stood helpless at the mouth of the black hole, a jagged maw in the mountainside that seemed to breathe a cold older than memory. They were waiting for one man, Sheriff Banquo Fletcher, who had walked into that absolute darkness 3 days prior, hunting a killer the rest of them were too terrified to pursue. Now, silence was their only answer. Did the legendary lawman finally meet his match? Not in a man, but in the earth itself. Today, we go back to that moment of terrifying uncertainty to uncover the truth of the man who walked into a legend and came back forever changed. The 2 men who died weren't just company guards, they were Blackwater County men. The first was Thomas Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of his 50 years in the mines. His hands were thick with calluses, but they were gentle with his grandchildren. He'd taken the guard job to get out of the deep shafts, hoping for a few quiet years before he retired. The second was David Eames, barely 20 years old, with a quick smile and eyes full of plans to marry his sweetheart and buy a small plot of land downriver. They weren't heroes or gunslingers. They were just ordinary men, trying to earn a living in a world that offered few easy paths. Their world was one of stark contrasts. The green, ancient mountains held communities bound by blood and tradition, where folks lived by the seasons and the grace of God. But cutting through this old world were the black veins of the new one, the coal mines. Company towns sprung up overnight, filled with the soot of the tipple and the clang of steel on rock. Life was hard, pay was low, and the company store kept everyone in a state of perpetual debt. This friction between the old ways and the new money created a constant, simmering tension. The payroll wagon was a symbol of it all, a tempting prize moving through a land of desperate men. Standing watch over this fragile peace was Sheriff Banquo Fletcher. Before he became a legend, he was simply the law. He was a constant, predictable presence, as much a part of the landscape as the hawk circling the ridge. You'd see him at the general store, not saying much, but listening to everything. He knew whose cow had gone missing, whose son was running with the wrong crowd, and which feuds were simmering just below the surface. He was the community's anchor, a man who believed in a simple, unshakable truth. There was right and there was wrong, and it was his job to stand on that line. But Fletcher was more than just a badge. He was born of these hills, and he understood their silent language. He felt the weight of every family's troubles, every whispered fear. This connection to his people was his strength, but it was also a heavy burden. He saw the desperation the coal companies bred, and he knew it would eventually boil over into violence. He was one man holding back a flood, and he knew it. His quiet, solitary life was a reflection of the immense responsibility he carried on his shoulders alone. The world that was, before Silas Kane pulled the trigger, was one of fragile order. It was a community holding its breath, praying that the simmering tensions wouldn't erupt into open flame. Thomas Miller and David Eames were part of that order, men doing their duty. Sheriff Fletcher was its ultimate guardian, but their peaceful world had a shadow, a dark place where the law didn't reach and fear held sway. The murder of those two guards wasn't just a crime, it was a challenge. It was Silas Kane declaring that the old rules were dead and that even the mountains couldn't protect you anymore. The scene of the attack was on a lonely stretch of road winding through a deep cut in the mountain, a place where the sun struggled to reach the forest floor even at midday. The payroll wagon sat askew, one wheel splintered in a ditch. The two horses stood unnaturally still in their harnesses, their heads bowed, their coats trembling despite the cool air. A profound and terrible silence had fallen over the hollow, broken only by the drip of water from moss-covered rocks. The payroll box was gone, its hasp broken and discarded in the mud. The bodies of Miller and Eames lay where they fell, covered by canvas blankets that couldn't hide the dark stains seeping into the earth. When Sheriff Fletcher arrived, he didn't join the quiet, grim-faced huddle of men who had discovered the wagon. He moved away from them, his grey eyes scanning not the wagon, but the woods surrounding it. He walked the perimeter of the clearing in a slow, deliberate circle, his gaze fixed on the ground. He was reading the forest floor like a page in a book, taking in every bent twig, every disturbed patch of last year's leaves. He was a man searching for a story, and he knew these woods would tell him the truth if he just knew how to listen. The clues he found were chilling, not for what they revealed, but for what they didn't. There were no signs of a struggle, no frantic footprints of men running for their lives. There was only one set of tracks leading from the tree line and one set leading back. They were from a single man, a heavy man, moving with a calm, unhurried gait. And then Fletcher found the most unnerving clue of all. On a flat, mossy rock about 20 yards from the wagon, he found 2 spent rifle cartridges. They weren't scattered where they would have been ejected from the chamber. They were placed neatly side by side, like a pair of cufflinks set out for church. This was what unsettled everyone more than the violence itself. This wasn't the work of a panicked thief. The careful placement of the shells was a message. It was a statement of absolute control, of a chilling lack of fear. It spoke of a killer who had watched his victims fall and then taken the time to gather his brass and leave a signature. The wilderness offered no easy answers, only a multitude of unsettling questions. Who was this man? And what kind of cold-blooded pride did it take to commit murder and then pause to arrange the evidence like a trophy? The scene spoke not of chaos, but of a terrifying, predatory calm. Before the dust had even settled on the lonely mountain road, a name was already being whispered from the company town to the deepest hollows. It was the name of a man with a grudge as raw and public as an open wound. Jedediah Schofield. Schofield was a miner, or at least he had been. He was a man known for a temper as hot as a forge and a pride as sharp and brittle as shale. And everyone in Blackwater County knew he hated Thomas Miller with a passion that burned cold. The bad blood had started 6 months earlier, deep in the belly of the earth. Schofield, a top man with the dynamite, had gotten into a bitter argument with another miner. an argument that turned into a brutal fistfight right there in the shaft. The shift foreman had been Thomas Miller. Following company rules, Miller reported the fight, and since Schofield had thrown the first punch, he was the one who was fired. He lost his job, his pay, and the small company house where his family lived. In a single day, he was cast out. To a man like Schofield, this was more than losing a job. It was a public shaming. He blamed Thomas Miller entirely, seeing him not as a man doing his duty, but as a traitor who had sided with the company against his own kind. In the weeks that followed, Schofield's bitterness festered. He was seen in the local saloons, his voice thick with moonshine and rage, vowing revenge. More than one person heard him swear that he would see Miller in his grave before he and his family starved. The whispers quickly turned into a roar of accusation. Jedediah Schofield owned a deer rifle, the same caliber as the shells Fletcher had found. He was a crack shot, known for his skill in the woods. Most damning of all, when the deputy went to the rundown shack Schofield's family had moved into, he was gone. His wife, her face pale with fear, claimed he'd gone hunting a few days back and hadn't returned, but the community saw it differently. To them, it was an open and shut case. A man with a clear motive, the right skills, and who had conveniently vanished at the exact time of the crime. Schofield had run, and in the mountains, only a guilty man runs. While the whole county had its eyes fixed on Jedediah Schofield, Sheriff Fletcher's gaze, grey and steady as a river stone, settled on someone else entirely. It was a person so close to the tragedy that no one thought to look at him. Caleb Thorne, the best friend of the young guard, David Eames. Caleb and David had been inseparable since they were boys, their bond forged in the creeks and woods of Blackwater County. They were two sides of the same coin, sharing every secret and every dream of a life beyond the coal dust. No one seemed more devastated by David's death than Caleb. No one, that is, except Sheriff Fletcher. He had seen grief in all its forms, and Caleb's felt wrong. It was too loud, too theatrical. At the funeral, Caleb wept with a noise that drowned out the quiet sorrow of the boy's own mother. But Fletcher, standing at the back of the cemetery, noted that for all the performance, the man's eyes were sharp and restless. He wasn't looking at the grave, he was watching the crowd. Fletcher knew that true grief turns a man inward, but Caleb Thorne was looking outward, like a man checking to see if his story was being believed. Beneath that mask of sorrow was a secret that was rotting Caleb from the inside out. He wasn't just a simple mine worker, he was a gambler who had fallen in deep with a dangerous crowd from the railroad camps. He owed a debt so large it was a death sentence, and the men he owed were not known for their patience. The company payroll wasn't just a target of opportunity for him, it was his only way out. His best friend, David Eames, hadn't just been a friend. He was Caleb's unwitting key to the prize, a source of information about the wagon's route and its schedule. The whispers started when Caleb was seen just days after the funeral, paying off a chunk of his debt at a saloon with crisp bills. When questioned, he claimed he'd won a lucky hand at cards. But the story felt thin, and his behavior, when re-examined, painted a darker picture. People now remembered Caleb asking David pointed questions about the guard rotation, questions that seemed innocent at the time, but now felt sinister. The idea was almost too ugly to consider, that the attack wasn't a random ambush, but a meticulously planned execution, and that David Eames might have been betrayed by the one person on earth he trusted completely. But there was a third shadow in these hills, one cast not by a single man, but by the towering black tipple of the mine itself. The Black Mountain Coal Company was more than an employer. It was a hungry, faceless power from the north, and its interests rarely aligned with the well-being of the men it paid in scrip. In the months leading up to the robbery, a new kind of man had been seen in the county. Men in dark suits and city hats, with faces as hard and emotionless as the company ledger books. They weren't miners or managers. They were troubleshooters, company enforcers, and their presence felt like the stillness before a storm. Their motive was impersonal, but immense. Whispers of unionizing had been snaking through the mine shafts, talk of better pay and safer conditions. To the company, the union wasn't a negotiation. It was a disease to be eradicated. A violent, unsolved payroll robbery was the perfect pretext. It would justify flooding the county with their own heavily armed guards, men who answered not to the law, but to the company. They could lock down the towns, root out the organizers, and break the spirit of the rebellion under the guise of protecting the people from a phantom killer. Miller and Eames, in this cold calculation, were simply the cost of doing business. The arrival of these city men had draped a blanket of unease over the community. They didn't speak to locals, they observed, their eyes taking measure of everything. They were seen mapping the roads, timing the payroll wagon's route, and holding quiet, tense meetings behind the locked door of the company office. Their presence was a silent, constant threat. It was a clear message from the powers up north that they were watching, and that they would not tolerate dissent. The mountain folk, who had dealt with their own problems for generations, now felt the chilling gaze of an outside world that saw their home as nothing more than a resource to be exploited and controlled. The crime itself bore the hallmarks of this cold, corporate ruthlessness. The clean, efficient nature of the ambush, the lack of any wasted motion, and especially the chilling signature of the carefully placed shell casings. It all felt less like the hot-blooded revenge of a fired miner and more like the work of a professional. It was a calculated act of terror designed to create chaos. Perhaps the stolen money was never the point. Perhaps the real prize was fear itself, a tool the company could wield to crush the growing defiance of the men who worked and died in its mines. With Jedediah Schofield named as the prime suspect, a posse of grim-faced men formed, fueled by righteous anger and cheap corn liquor. They were ready to deliver mountain justice with a rope. Sheriff Fletcher led them, but he moved with a different purpose. While the others saw a clear trail of vengeance, Fletcher saw a path that was too obvious, too neat. He wasn't hunting a man he hated, he was solving a puzzle, and he knew the first piece you find isn't always the one that fits. For 4 days, they beat the brush, scouring the unforgiving ridges and impenetrable rhododendron thickets that Schofield called home. The mountains, however, are experts at hiding men, and the trail was cold. It wasn't Fletcher who found him, but a young deputy who stumbled upon an old trapper's lean-to deep in a forgotten hollow. Inside, they found Jedediah Schofield, not defiant, but gaunt and shivering, his rifle unused beside him. He hadn't been running from the law, he had been hiding from it. He knew he was the first man they'd blame, and his terror was so genuine it was almost palpable. His alibi, when it came, was as solid and immovable as the mountain itself. He had been miles away from the ambush, helping the circuit preacher, old Reverend Eli, repair the roof on the remote Black Creek Chapel. He'd been there for a solid week, sleeping in the church and sharing the preacher's meager meals. The Reverend, a man whose word was considered scripture in those parts, confirmed it without a moment's hesitation. Jedediah Schofield was a man full of rage and bitterness, but he was no killer. The most promising lead had evaporated into thin mountain air. Attention then shifted to Caleb Thorne, but that trail was made of smoke and mirrors. There was no physical evidence, only the foul taste of suspicion. He had an answer for everything. The money? A lucky night playing cards with strangers at a railroad camp, men who were long gone. His odd questions to David. Just the normal curiosity of a friend. The community, unwilling to stomach the thought of such a venomous betrayal, chose to believe him. To accuse him without proof was to call one of their own a monster, a truth too ugly to face. The investigation had hit a wall of solid granite, leaving Sheriff Fletcher with nothing but a pair of spent shells and a county where the fear was beginning to grow teeth. With the official investigation stalled, a cold fog of silence settled over Blackwater County. The lively chatter at the general store died down whenever Sheriff Fletcher walked in. Doors that were once open were now latched, and eyes that met yours on the road would slide away, refusing to connect. It was as if the whole community had collectively agreed to forget the murders had ever happened. Neighbors who had once shared every piece of gossip now saw nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing. The truth, it seemed, was a dangerous secret to possess. This silence was woven from three distinct threads. The first was raw, simple fear. A killer was among them, a man who had shot down 2 people in cold blood and left a chilling signature of his arrogance. He was a ghost, a name without a face, and he could be anyone. To speak a word of what you might have seen, to even speculate out loud, was to risk drawing his attention. It was to risk waking up and finding your own grim message left on your doorstep. The wolf was still in the woods, and no one wanted to be the next sheep to stray from the flock. The second thread was a deep, abiding hatred for the Black Mountain Coal Company. To many of the mountain folk, the company was a far greater evil than any one killer. It was a faceless monster that stole their land, poisoned their streams, and worked their men to death for pennies. The stolen money belonged to the company, and the dead guards were on the company payroll. In their minds, helping Fletcher was helping the company. It was a choice between 2 evils, and many chose silence as a form of quiet rebellion against the power that oppressed them every single day. But the thickest, strongest thread was the mountain code itself, an unspoken omerta, as binding as any law on the books. You did not talk to the law about the affairs of your neighbors. You handled your own business, settled your own scores, and you never, ever turned on your own kind for an outsider. And to many, even Sheriff Fletcher, in his official capacity, was an outsider to family matters. This loyalty, this stubborn, ingrained belief in their own form of justice, formed a wall far higher and stronger than any prison. Fletcher found himself on the outside of his own community, a lawman trying to find a killer in a town that had gone deaf, dumb, and blind. 5 years turned to dust. The seasons in Blackwater County rolled on, covering the memory of the murders with layers of autumn leaves and winter snow. The case went cold, a ghost story whispered by old men, a permanent quiet failure that Sheriff Banquo Fletcher carried in the lines on his face. The 2 spent shells still sat on his desk in a small wooden box, a cold testament to a question he couldn't answer. The community's wall of silence had held, and the truth seemed lost to time. The clue that broke it all came not from a clever deduction or a piece of new evidence, but from the rambling memory of an old woman on the edge of the next world. Granny Elspeth lived in a one-room cabin perched like a hawk's nest on a ridge overlooking the very road where the ambush took place. Her mind, the folks in town said, was a tangled thicket of memories and mountain lore, and her words were often dismissed as the wind in the pines. Fletcher, however, made a point of checking on the old woman, bringing her salt and flour when the snows were deep. On one such visit, sitting by her hearth, he listened as she drifted through the past. She spoke of the hard winter of '08, of a blight that killed the chestnut trees, and then, without any change in her tone, she said something that made the air in the tiny cabin stand still. "Such a shame about that young Eames boy," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the fire. "He was always so polite. I saw him walking up the road that very morning with his friend, Caleb Thorne. They was laughing, heads together like they was sharing a secret. Not an hour later, I heard the guns." For Sheriff Fletcher, it was as if the last 5 years had collapsed into a single blinding instant. Caleb Thorne's alibi had been rock solid. He had been at the mine, working a full shift. Multiple men had sworn to it. But Granny Elspeth, whose cabin sat miles from the mine entrance, had seen him on the murder road with the victim just before he died. It wasn't a confession she offered, but a simple, unvarnished memory, one that nobody had ever thought to ask for. The old woman, dismissed by everyone, had been the only witness. In that moment, the entire case was reborn. Fletcher realized the horrifying truth. Caleb's alibi hadn't been solid. It had been constructed. He had paid or threatened his fellow miners to lie for him, a conspiracy of silence bought with stolen payroll money. The laughter Granny Elspeth heard hadn't been the sound of friendship. It had been the sound of betrayal. The case wasn't just cold. It had been buried alive. And Sheriff Fletcher had just been handed the shovel. A 5-year-old lie is a brittle thing. With Granny Elspeth's testimony in his pocket, Sheriff Fletcher moved with the cold patience of a winter freeze. He didn't go for Caleb Thorne. Not yet. He went for the men who had built the walls of his alibi. He found them one by one, in the mines, in their homes, at the saloon. He didn't threaten or shout. He simply sat with them, his grey eyes unblinking, and told them what the old woman on the ridge had seen. He spoke of perjury, of being an accessory to murder, and then he would fall silent, letting the weight of what they had done crush them. The first miner held out for an hour, the second for 10 minutes. The third broke before Fletcher even finished his sentence. The confrontation, when it came, was on the porch of the small, respectable house Caleb Thorne had bought with his blood money. He had grown soft in 5 years, the desperate gambler replaced by a man who believed his own lies. He greeted the sheriff with a confident smile, but it faltered and died when he saw the look on Fletcher's face. The lawman wasn't there for a social call. "I spoke with Granny Elspeth," Fletcher began, his voice flat. "She remembers seeing you that morning, Caleb, on the road with David, just before the shots." Caleb scoffed, a dry, rattling sound. "An old woman's fancies. I was at the mine. Ask anyone." And that was the moment Fletcher sprung the trap. "I did," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I asked Tom Jenkins, and I asked Sam Carter." Their memories seemed to have gotten a lot clearer in the last 24 hours. The color drained from Caleb's face. The mask of the respected citizen shattered, revealing the terrified, cornered animal beneath. Fletcher took a step closer, his shadow falling over the other man. "But here's the thing that's been bothering me, Caleb. The tracks at the scene, they were from a big man, a heavy man, and those shells placed so neat. That wasn't your style. You're a coward. You always were. You didn't have the nerve to pull the trigger." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and cold. "You just led your best friend into the woods to be slaughtered like a hog. You gave the route, the time, everything. And you did it for a man in a city suit, a company man, the one who came down to break the union talk, a big man named Corbin." Fletcher's voice was relentless, each word a hammer blow breaking down the last of Caleb's defenses. "He pulled the trigger, and you collected your 30 pieces of silver. It was all there, the whole sickening truth. It wasn't a crime of passion or a simple robbery born of desperation. It was a cold-blooded business deal. The Black Mountain Coal Company needed an excuse to crush its workers, and Caleb Thorne, drowning in debt, was their willing instrument. He sold out his friend, his community, and his own soul. Caleb didn't confess with words. He simply collapsed, folding in on himself on the porch steps, a hollowed-out man whose guilt was now as plain to see as the mountains against the sky. The ghost finally had a face, and it was the face of a friend. Let us now step back into the shadows of that terrible morning. This is not a story from a court record, but a reconstruction pieced together from a confession, a dying woman's memory, and the cold logic of the crime scene itself. This is how it must have been. The morning air was cool and heavy, with the damp smell of moss and wet earth. David Eames walked up the road with a lightness in his step, laughing at a joke told by the man he trusted most in the world, Caleb Thorne. He was young, and his mind was on his future, not on the deep shadows pooling between the ancient trees. From those shadows, a shape detached itself. A big man in a city coat, his face impassive. This was Corbin, the company enforcer. There was no warning, no shouted demand. David likely didn't even have time to register the man as a threat before the hollow was shattered by a single flat crack that was not thunder. It was a sound that slapped the air and sent the birds scattering from the trees in a frantic, silent explosion. It was not a fight. It was an execution. For David, There would have been a moment of searing confusion, a feeling of the world tilting on its axis, and perhaps, in his last second of sight, he would have seen his best friend's face contorted, not with surprise, but with a terrible, knowing guilt. Thomas Miller, a man who had survived 30 years of rockfalls and dynamite blasts, was a professional. His hand would have instinctively dropped to the pistol on his hip. But he was not a gunfighter, and he was facing a different kind of danger than the mountain had ever offered. A second crack echoed the first, a brutal full stop to the sentence that had just begun. The reins slipped from his calloused hands, and his 50 years of hard-earned life spilled out onto the dirt road he had traveled 1,000 times. The aftermath was a scene of chilling, methodical precision. The big man, Corbin, moved with an unhurried grace. He walked to the mossy rock and deliberately placed the two spent shells side by side, a gesture of pure, contemptuous power. It was his signature on a piece of human wreckage. The sharp tang of gunpowder hung in the air, a profane incense in the cathedral of the woods. Then, from deep in the rhododendron, came a different sound, a wretched, heaving gasp. It was the sound of Caleb Thorne, the Judas, being sick in the bushes, his body finally rebelling against the monstrous thing his greed had unleashed. When they were done, the payroll box was opened, and the money exchanged hands. One man walked away with a clean kill and a broken union. The other stumbled away with a lifetime of guilt and blood on his hands that no amount of money could ever wash clean. After the sound of their departure faded, the woods fell silent again. But it was a new kind of silence. It was heavier, broken, and for a long, long time, the birds did not return to their song. The Blackwater County Courthouse had never seen a trial like it. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of the entire community, a sea of grim, weathered faces. It was a pressure cooker of old grief and new anger. At the defendant's table sat two men who were worlds apart. Caleb Thorne was a ghost, a hollowed-out man who stared at the floorboards as if they held the secrets to his damnation. Beside him, cool and impassive, sat Corbin, the company man. Flanked by lawyers from the city with slicked-back hair and alligator-skin briefcases, he looked not like a man on trial for his life, but like a landowner inspecting a property he was about to foreclose on. The trial became a battle not over facts, but over which world held more truth. The county prosecutor presented a simple, brutal story of betrayal, backed by the tearful, coerced confessions of the miners who had lied for Caleb. He put Granny Elspeth on the stand, her voice frail, but her memory clear as a mountain spring. But Corbin's lawyers were masterful. They painted a picture of a backwards, ignorant community engaged in a conspiracy against the company that fed them. They portrayed Granny Elspeth as a senile old woman, the miners as liars trying to save their own skins, and Caleb Thorne as a desperate man who would say anything to lessen his own sentence. For Caleb Thorne, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. His confession and the testimony of the men he'd paid off sealed his fate. The jury, made up of men he had known his whole life, looked at him not with hatred, but with a profound and weary contempt. They found him guilty of being an accessory to murder in less than an hour. The judge, his voice like cracking stone, sentenced him to life at hard labor in the state penitentiary. Caleb didn't even flinch. He was led away in chains, a man who had already started serving his sentence 5 years earlier in a prison of his own making. But for Corbin, the wheels of justice turned differently. They were greased with company money. His lawyers produced train tickets, hotel registries, and sworn affidavits from businessmen in Knoxville, all placing him 100 miles away on the day of the murders. It was a perfect, ironclad alibi, constructed with the same cold precision as the crime itself. Faced with the contradictory testimony of mountain folk on one side and documented, official-looking proof on the other, the jury was paralyzed by doubt. The word of a dozen miners could not outweigh a single stamped piece of paper from the city. After 2 days of deliberation, they delivered their verdict. For the murder of Thomas Miller and David Eames, the jury found the defendant, Mr. Corbin, not guilty. A wave of stunned silence washed over the courtroom, followed by a low, collective growl of disbelief. Corbin showed no emotion. He simply adjusted his tie, shook his lawyer's hands, and walked out of the courthouse a free man, leaving the people of Blackwater County choking on a brand of justice that felt more like poison. The law had punished the traitor, but the man who pulled the trigger had vanished back into the world of money and power from which he came, as untouchable as a shadow. For the families of Thomas Miller and David Eames, the verdicts brought no peace, only a quiet, permanent ache. The community wrapped its arms around them, but their losses carved out a silence that could never be filled. David's sweetheart, a girl whose future had been so bright, never married. She grew into a quiet, sad-eyed woman who always wore a locket with his picture, her life a long, slow testament to a promise that was broken by a bullet. The Millers, once a boisterous and central family in the county, drew into themselves, their grief a constant, unspoken presence at their dinner table. They had received the law's answer, but it did nothing to quiet the echoes of the guns. Jedediah Schofield, the man who had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, was legally a free man, but his reputation never fully recovered. In the hollows, where memories are long and suspicion is a survival instinct, the stain of the accusation lingered. He was no longer the hot-tempered miner. He was the man they almost hung for the payroll. The whispers followed him, poisoning his relationships and curdling his already bitter spirit. He became a solitary man, his anger at the world turning inward, leaving him isolated by a crime he did not commit. He was a second kind of victim, his life forever altered by the lie that had almost cost him everything. Caleb Thorne's fate was a slow erasure. He was sent to the state prison, a brutal place of rock quarries and sun-baked fields from which few men returned whole. His name in Blackwater County became a curse, a cautionary tale told to children about the evils of greed and betrayal. His family, unable to bear the shame, sold their small plot of land and moved away in the dead of night, their name vanishing from the county records as if they had never existed. Caleb Thorne simply ceased to be a person, becoming a number in a ledger, a ghost haunting the prison walls until he was forgotten by all but one man. And Corbin? He vanished like a wisp of smoke. The Black Mountain Coal Company, its union problem now brutally solved, transferred him out of the state. He left no records, no forwarding address, no trace. He was a phantom, an instrument of corporate will who had done his job and been recalled. For the people of Blackwater County, his acquittal was a bitter lesson in the nature of power. It proved what they had always suspected, that there were two kinds of law in the world. There was their law, the law of the mountains, and there was the company's law, the law of money, which could make a murderer disappear in broad daylight. This case changed Banquo Fletcher. The sight of Corbin walking free carved something deep into his soul. It taught him that the courthouse could deliver a verdict, but not always justice. He grew quieter, more solitary, his methods more relentless. He had seen the law fail, and in that failure he seemed to find a harder resolve. He would deliver his man to the courthouse if he could, but he would deliver justice no matter what. The memory of Corbin's smug, emotionless face would fuel his hunt for every outlaw that followed, a cold fire that would one day lead him to the mouth of the black hole in pursuit of a different killer and a different, darker kind of judgment. If you travel the back roads of Blackwater County today, you can still find the scars left by this story. The old company road is paved now, but the deep cut where the ambush happened remains, a place where the shadows lie a little thicker and the air feels a little colder. In the town square, the old courthouse still stands, its brick facade a silent witness to the flawed justice it once dispensed. But the most tangible remnants lie in the church graveyard, on a hill overlooking the valley. There you will find two simple, weathered stones side by side. One for Thomas Miller, a husband and father. The other for David Eames, a son and brother. Their names, carved in stone, are a permanent record of a debt that was never fully paid. Down by the river, the Black Mountain Coal Company tipple is a skeleton of rust and rot, slowly being devoured by kudzu and time. It stands as a monument not to industry, but to a forgotten era of exploitation and greed. The company is long gone, its name just a whisper on the wind, but the distrust it sowed took deep root in that mountain soil. For generations after, the arrival of any man in a suit from the city was met with a wall of silent, watchful suspicion. The story of Corbin became a cautionary tale, a lesson taught to children about the kind of evil that money can buy and the law cannot touch. The tragedy of the payroll murders lives on, not in history books, but in the way a story survives in the mountains, through folklore. Old folks still tell it, sometimes as a ghost story, sometimes as a lesson in betrayal. They say that if you listen closely on a still night, you can still hear the echo of those 2 gunshots rolling through the hollow. And for a while, there was even a song, a mournful ballad passed around the campfires and front porches called Caleb's Coin, a tune that spoke of the terrible price of 30 pieces of silver earned in a friend's blood. This is how a crime becomes a part of the landscape. It's more than just a memory. It becomes a piece of the county's identity, a part of its DNA. The story of what happened on that lonely road reinforced the mountain code, hardening it. It taught the people that the law of outsiders was fickle, and that their own silence, while sometimes a shield for the guilty, was their only true protection. While the world outside might forget, the Appalachian Mountains themselves hold these memories, etched into the landscape and the hearts of its people. At the beginning of our story, we asked a simple question. Who was responsible for the deaths of Thomas Miller and David Eames? The answer, we found, was never simple at all. The law points to one man, Caleb Thorne, a traitor who paid for his sin with the rest of his life. And in the cold, hard print of a law book, that is where the story ends. But we know better. We know that justice in these hills is rarely so neat. The man who pulled the trigger walked free, his guilt washed clean by money and a well-told lie, leaving behind a wound in the heart of the county that never truly healed. This story, then, is not just about a crime. It is about the brutal collision of 2 worlds, the old world of mountain honor and the new world of corporate greed that saw men not as souls, but as numbers on a ledger. It's a lesson in how a community's silence can hide a monster, but also how the quietest voice, that of a forgotten old woman, can be the one that finally speaks the truth. For Sheriff Banquo Fletcher, it was a crucible. It burned away any naive faith he had in a system and forged in him an unshakable belief in a higher, harder law, the mountains law, where a man's guilt is not decided by a jury, but by the weight of his own sins. The court records in the state capital will tell you that this case is closed. But here, in the deep hollows where the truth still whispers on the wind, the story is very much alive. It serves as a stark reminder that while the law may have its verdict, the mountains have their memory. And that memory is long, and it is unforgiving. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story, or at least as much of it as the mountains are willing to give up.